Hello, everyone.
Hello.
How's it going?
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello.
To
Greetings.
Welcome to Compress It Like an Idiot. This is my new thing I'm going to try on YouTube. I'm going to get a bunch of people together. We're going to chat about music and culture and tech and art and all kinds of things, but with specific sort of topics to keep us on track. So on this occasion, we're going to talk about mastering and or mixing and EQing and all that stuff, but mostly mastering. Like, what is it? What's it for? Like, why do we need it? When do we need to worry about it? Ways to approach it, and just sort of like just chat about things, share our experiences, whatever. I've invited, and everyone here is either currently or formerly on my Patreon, so thanks everyone for that. I have Nick and Aaron here. Wave so that people know who you are.
Hello.
So you guys are mastering engineers, and I've invited you along here to essentially be the mastering masterminds.
Okay. No. I'm done. I'm so done right now.
Aaron, you mastered my album Mode 2 in 2021.
Uh-huh.
And you're over in Texas, right?
Yeah.
And Nick, remind me where you were again? You're in Latvia.
I'm in Latvia, yes.
And we met on a Patreon call a year or so ago, and you sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole regarding what you're doing with, kind of customizing Ableton to use as like a mastering suite.
Yeah. That was the start of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty cool. So I've got like a few notes here of things that we can sort of riff about with. If anyone at any point just wants to add anything or ask a question or whatever, feel free to do so. It's just it's like a pub. It's like a pub. It's kind of a music tech pub type thing.
Does anyone want a drink?
Yeah, and but don't no smoking marijuana or anything like that because I might get kicked off.
All you UK fellows have it really fun right now because y'all are not too late to be drinking alcohol. So
You could drink now,
over
Aaron.
here, nope, I'm not gonna do it. That would be uncouth.
Hey, it's 5 o'clock somewhere.
What time
It
is
is
it?
5 o'clock somewhere.
It is currently 3 p.m.
That's fine. It's Saturday.
No.
Perfect time. Happy hour.
Yeah.
I'm using leaf soup.
As Johnny Depp said, isn't happy hour any time? Anyway. Cheers all. So, does anyone want to tell me what mastering is?
I'm not going first.
Magic. Black magic.
Voodoo.
Well, I don't have any particular academic knowledge about it, right? I just judge from what I've sort of been absorbing through this time of working on and mastering stuff for my friends and for releases. I think there's mastering engineer is like a person who you trust will make the final cuts of your music sound better than you can yourself. And I think the biggest sort of value in that is trust, exactly. So you trust this person knows how good music sounds, and he can actually have this setup which allows him to make these judgments, these decisions, critical, confidently. And I think it shifted a little bit since the kind of previously everything was cut on vinyl, then CD came along, and the tools changed quite a little bit, and sort of the view on what is final master should sound like as well, especially recently with streaming services emerging. You can't really compress everything how it was during the Loudness wars on CDs, because the streaming services have this average which they measure, it's called LUFS. So essentially it just measures how loud the song is on a certain period, and will still dive down if it's really compressed. So your compressed music, which will sound really great and loud on your computer, will sound not competitive at all in comparison with other similar tracks on on Spotify, for example, because it will just get the loudness down to kind of match the level Spotify is looking for. So I think master engineers nowadays mostly aimed to deliver this most competitive level to this streaming services, and you have to be aware of that. A lot of mastering engineers that I've been following do not really look for these numbers. They just make the track sound really great, and in a lot of cases you can't really do anything because it's already kind of put together and mixed. But yeah, in my opinion, mastering is a final pass with someone you actually trust, and whose ears you trust, whose toolset you trust, who can make the sound better. And I remember Steve Albini, in one of the interviews, someone asked him, like, have you ever sent something to mastering and it came out like worse? And he said no. Like, every time he sends something to master engineer, it comes back better than it was when it left his studio. And Albini, just some context, Albini is the guy who owns Electrical Audio Studio in Chicago, who recorded like Bush, Nirvana, like really famous guy, incredibly talented, like legendary. So yeah, I think that's a good kind of overview from my side and why you really should kind of try it at least.
Aaron, what do you think? What would you say?
I would say that my experience has been that the goal is to homogenize and guarantee translation across the greatest number of consumer listening devices or whatever. I guess that's the point of like saturation, you know. It's like you're kind of like blurring these very precisely arrived at frequencies. Like say your sub, most people's subs are like pretty like tuned to the room that they're in or whatever, but when you're going to a different system or whatever, it might not respond on that. So you introduce saturation to kind of like add harmonics to where you have just a greater number. You're just kind of like widening the net, really. I think you're widening the net of like widening the sweet spot. Even that's pretty good for like in reverse. It's like a reverse thing. I don't know if this makes any sense. I'm not a public speaker.
That's fine. It's all good. Yeah, well, I mean, so I've never done any mastering, and I don't really plan to do it because there are people out there who can do it for me, which is totally fine with me. But like, it took me it took me a while to wrap my head around the idea. Like, my earliest experience of coming across the term was when I did like my first studio recording session with this band I was in the mid-late 90s. And, we did it in this, we did it at very sort of, at the time, it was very sort of old-fashioned to tape and mastering to DAT tape and stuff like that. Kind of old-fashioned, not for the time, it was maybe on its way out. But, we got our masters, as it were, on a DAT tape. And then we were like, well, how are we going to listen to this? We haven't got a DAT machine. And we went to look at buying a DAT machine and they were like £500. And we were like, what are we going to do? So one of our lecturers at our college said, oh, give it to me. I've got a DAT machine at home. I'll do a little bit of like mastering. And we were like, but surely it's already mastered because we've got the master tape. And he was like, no. We need to make sure everything's all the same level and stuff. So I just thought that it was just like, you just make things the same volume so that one track isn't louder than the other one. And so like when I started doing it by myself, I was just doing things like normalizing tracks in Cool Edit. Because I was just thinking, well, that's going to make them all the same volume. And, that's clearly nonsense. And at the time, a flatmate of mine was like, he was using this thing called T-Rax. Anyone remember T-Rax in the early 2000s? It was kind of like a a little. It was a mastering software suite for Windows.
Still have it.
You still have it, really? Yeah. But, and so that was kind of when it was a little bit like, oh, so there's a compressor and an EQ in here, and there's all these sorts of things, and actually, like, there's a whole amount of more processing that goes into it. So it's actually a lot more of an art form and a science in itself, rather than just being like, oh, you just normalize everything. So it's good to like hear some other perspectives. So I'm just looking at my notes, and like, because I know that when we were doing my album, Aaron, I was a little bit self-conscious about how if I was giving you something that you could work with.
Okay.
Because I remember like I had a guy master something I did previously, and I wrote to him and I was like, you know, how do you want this? And he was like, well, don't put any dynamic processing on the master. And I was like, oh shit. I slammed everything for about 8 compressors on the master, and I took everything off, and I was like, my mix is ruined. I'm gonna have to like remix it. So I had to remix all these tracks in like a week because I was mixing into the compressor. So I think what I'm getting at is that like, what are good things as the producer? What are good things to be wary of before you're sending stuff off to master it, like headroom and like, because people love chucking compressors on the master track. It sounds sick, but
It does.
is it good?
It does.
Is it a good thing to do?
It does, but what we want though is to be able to have latitude in movement from, I guess, the latitude of control that we want is to be able to control the dynamic range. We don't want to have to like be stuck to a certain dynamic range that's already been like preordained by someone who's not doing this for a living, like doing mastering for a living.
Seems to be quite a gap between, well, I found really interesting between how Nick was describing the process and you're describing the process. And on a spectrum, what would be, one sounds more creative and one sounds more technical. Nick, you mentioned, you know, trusting someone's ears. There's a kind of a thing here. I mean, how does that work? I mean, how much of a creative process is that? Is this really where do you sit on the spectrum? Some people are more technical with it and just trying to get things leveled out right, and other people were literally going to add a little bit additional secret sauce. I mean,
I would say it's more technical than creative, because you have to hear the distortion if it's there. You have to hear things that artists may have missed, and you want to make sure they don't creep into the mastering, because sometimes some resonant frequencies from one oscillator is just constantly ringing somewhere in the mix, and he doesn't hear it for whatever reason. Maybe his translation is not perfect, or maybe he just didn't pay much attention to it because he was in the groove in the moment trying to get it sound really weird, something interesting. And during mastering, you don't have a lot of wiggle room to adjust kind of specific instruments, so you have to find these frequencies, just to tone them down a little or a bit much. And honestly, in my opinion, like, great mix might not even require particularly a lot of mastering, because if you have a great mix and you kind of have put thought through, or your mixing engineer just made it really nice and what you've expected it to sound, then mastering engineer maybe just puts like half dB here and there, and it's just done. So to me, it's part of ears, a lot of technicalities, and just a good set of tools which you can use to fix problems. That's it, at least in my...
Made me think if a mixing engineer does, is there an instance where if a mixing engineer does such a good job, mastering is not needed?
Oh yeah. I mean, again, some dynamic changes when you push into compressor, just a little bit, like make it a bit louder, and in general, like when you use compressor, and what Ned's been saying, Duncan, sorry. So when you use a compressor, you make this quiet parts louder, so your ears hear more details. And with like putting compressor, that's what you're doing. You're just pushing the lower levels up, and compressor doesn't let the loud parts go a lot like more up because it compresses them. So you're losing this dynamic range, which might be necessary for the track to have this groove actually. So sorry, I started rambling and
It's fine. It's
totally
fine.
good.
Ramble.
It's
I,
totally
I was
good.
just asking if a mixed engineer does such a. Is there an
Yeah,
instance? Where,
I think there are a lot of instances I've been viewing I've been subscribed to Mix with the Masters service, which has this great walkthrough with all the engineers and top-notch engineers who do mastering and mixing. And in a lot of cases where the mix which comes from the like big artists is pretty good already, so they don't need to do much. They just push, and they, for example, receive it like -6 or -3 dB. With digital, it's a lot less important because you have this huge dynamic range in digital. You don't need to push mix to 0 dB or to -3, like -6. I would say -12 would be completely fine. And this whole this whole idea and whole notion came from the tapes, because tapes had quite loud this hiss from biasing, and essentially you had this particularly limited signal to noise ratio. With digital recording, doesn't really matter because it's like 120 dB on some cards, so your noise is like completely like you can't even hear it. So just prepare. Some engineers just send you like -6, you push it to 0 to kind of just see how it levels. You push it into compressor to add some saturation, for example, from transformers, from tubes. You make it like a little bit like crispier, and basically you're done. And because the mix was so good, you really don't have to do much. But with me, with my personal experience, I don't think it ever happened, to be frank.
Because everyone's shit at mixing.
It's very true. It's very true.
It's not even, I don't think it's about even mixing, to be frank. I feel your setup needs to be like absolutely perfect, and when you're producing it's nearly impossible. You have to hear all the stuff, your room needs to be tuned, you have to be really used to the sound in this particular sweet spot which you have in your room, because it's impossible to make it like perfect everywhere, right? So the room gives you a lot of distortion from like on top of what's coming from your speakers. So I think the problem might not even be that people are shit at mixing because they just want to produce, they want something cool and they're already happy with what they have. But the speakers just doesn't translate what they should, and you don't hear a lot of things. Some frequencies are just pulled up, some frequencies are toned down because you have like the room resonates. So there's a lot of factors. It might not be about skill, but rather the configuration at which you work.
I have a question about levels. When I'm working on stuff, like I reference stuff between a few different headphones. Like, are you guys familiar with the Slate VSX headphones at all? Like simulates a bunch of different like speakers in it. And then I also have some Sony headphones, and I also use like Apple earpods. And when I reference the earbuds, like they can only go but so loud before they start distorting, and I kind of use that as like my last thing. And when I get it to sound good in there, and when I get it to be as loud as it can get, like if I listen to it in any other system or any of my other headphones, it feels like it's not loud enough. So I'm not sure which one is the more accurate thing, because if I push it any louder and I listen to my earbuds, which I think a lot of people are going to be listening on, it doesn't sound good. But then it's also not as loud as I would like it to be. Does anybody have any experience with what I'm talking about?
I think I know exactly what you're talking about. I think that you're talking about a resonance buildup that was not addressed in mastering. I feel like different like earbuds are going to be more sensitive to certain ranges than a I guess a floor standing speaker or a car system. Basically, what I do to address that, especially like phone speakers or whatever. If you're listening to something on Instagram, it always sounds like shit most of the time. And I guess really the only way I've gotten used to that is by having a couple of dummy Instagrams that I upload videos to just like see how it's going to sound or whatever. And
Interesting.
so like once you do, I think what my experience is like Instagram kind of excites if you go higher than 16 LUFS to negative 16 LUFS. But it's really like my phone is really sensitive around like 1.6K. And what I use to address it is a thing in Ozone. I'm using 8 is the spectral, let's see here, spectral shaper, I think. Spectral shaping. It's kind of like a transient shaper for a multiband transient shaper. It's not quite the same thing as a multiband compressor, because I guess the parameters or UI is a little bit more of a well, it's a different paradigm. So, another thing that can help a lot, and I cannot like shout this out enough, is Soothe 2 and Spiff by
I've heard about Soothe.
OK Sound.
I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah,
OK.
OEK Sound. Yeah, those are so helpful in removing resonance buildups because they track. It's like a key tracking EQ curve that you can set. Basically, without having to like automate across, without having to automate each band across like a set of notes or whatever, because like one note's going to resound more independently than there's just going to be a lot of like divergence across a range of notes from an instrument, and so you need something that's going to like follow along. And I think I'm rambling.
It's fine, this is ramble
I guess
friendly.
the thing
this
is,
sort of like a kind of. Oh, sorry. You go on, Steve. You go ahead. Go.
I was just gonna say. So, would you say then that the earbuds are accurate or not accurate, as far as like if I go louder than what they can handle, is it a bad thing or is it inaccurate?
It's all going to be like a here's a word.
Relative.
Well, it's just like you gotta pick what you're willing to. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the word.
Sacrifice.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yeah, exactly. Or just kind of go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead. I thought you. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So I think that it's just knowing what you're concerned about. Are you willing to sacrifice like a more engaging listen on another system to accommodate the limitations of a headphone?
Well, I just guess I assume most people are listening with Apple headphones than any other system.
Right. So, yeah. Then in that case, then that sounds like you would want to do that. It sounds like you'd want to like make that your, I guess, your priority.
Do you find that to be inaccurate, or do you find like people actually listen on other systems as well?
Can I jump in? I don't think it matters, to be frank. I don't think it matters if they are accurate or not, and none of the, like, however manufacturers put this frequency response curves, it really rarely is the case, even for headphones. And I don't think it matters too much. We like where you check your masters and mixers. With regards to loudness and where they distort, I think you should just remember the loudness which is satisfying to you, and I think you can use it as a reference for what you're looking for. And over the years where you're going through with these earbuds, listening to music, you just know things which sound right or sound good. And I think instinctively you are trying to master your track to kind of the same sound. And I think what's important is for you to use a consistent, like a consistent way to monitor, like whether it's an earbuds, whether it's a good set of speakers, monitors, whether it's whatever this is. Like you just have to get used to how good stuff sounds and try to master in the same level, same loudness. I, for example, have a like a speaker, like monitor controller on my desk, and I never touch the loudness button. It's always in one place. I know that these kind of I know how music needs to sound at this particular set of loudness of this level, output level, and I rarely touch the knob. I use dim to make it just sound a little bit less loud, and that's it. So you get used to this particular loudness, and you master to this loudness. If you can't really know what distorts your music when you go really loud. Is it the DAC? Is it the output section in your phone? Is it the headphones are bad and can't really reproduce certain frequencies? You really have no idea what actually do that. So you just get used to one loudness, get used to the tone you really like, and you try to kind of match it. That's it, in my opinion, at least.
Well, since you mentioned like loudness, where's like kind of the line between, and you might have to sort of fill me in on, you know, the term, but like where's the line between sort of like working by numbers and by metering and just by how actually physically loud something is, like on a system or something? Is it sort of like which one are you focused in on when you're working? If that makes sense.
You might need to repeat the question. I'm sorry, man.
I've always been a little bit confused, like with the term loudness, because I know that it kind of like, I mean, the only reason I know of it is because of things like the loudness war, which was like, oh, well, what's the loudness war? That's something maybe I'm not going to concern myself with, because that's more kind of like an industry type thing, conversation of like, you know, how loud can we go? But I was thinking more in terms of like loudness as a number or a meter on something versus the physical presence of sound coming through your speakers. Does that make sense? And what you're working with when you're doing your thing.
Do you want me to start, or do you want to take this?
You talking to me?
Yeah.
I guess you can start. I'm cool with that.
Yeah, because it's an interesting question. To touch on a loudness word, where it came from is when CDs came and this dynamic like 24-bit range came along. All the limitations of vinyl has been dropped, and vinyl pressing has quite a bit of limitations. It can, like, the louder you want pressing to sound, the wider the track needs to be, so less time is recorded on each side, and vinyl needs to be thicker. And you also needed this like low-end frequencies to be mono. You couldn't really pan like bass or kicks left and right because the needle would jump off. Because essentially, like how you get stereo from the vinyl, because it goes like diagonally, like 45 degrees. So if you have a kick, for example, on the one side, the needle will just be pushed onto one side and will not jump to the next one. So that's the reason where this mono bass myth came along. And for streaming, it's not really important. You can do whatever you want with bass now, like, and this myth still persists. There's sort of kind of an idea that our ear doesn't really perceive where basses or other low frequencies are coming from, so there's no particular sense to kind of make stereo for the low end. But I didn't find it particularly true. I think you can do like a lot of stuff with bass nowadays. But with regards to loudness, like when this loudness words and where it came from, I think Rick Rubin is one of the proponents of kind of this loudness words, because they at some point discovered that the louder you make your mix, your sound, the more people like it, because the more details they can actually hear. So rather than like focusing on specific areas of the song which were important or whatever, they just compress everything up. Everything sounds loud. The most notorious example was spoken briefly about Red Hot Chili Peppers. So Californication is probably the shittiest record I've heard. Like, it sounds like absolute dog shit. It distorts like crazy. And I'm surprised they still haven't remastered or remixed it, because it sounds like dog shit. So yeah, essentially this is where loudness words came from. And when streaming services started to emerge, they realized the difference between different tracks, like put on the streaming services, is vast. So 1 second you have like a jazz record playing, which is very moderate in loudness, and in second moment you have like a techno track which just blasts your speakers away. So what they did, they adopted this radio standard of measuring loudness similar to this root mean square, where you take a certain certain segments of the track, of the material, and they measure the loudness in certain regions of frequencies. And they really don't disclose how exactly it's done, so I'm just judging by the things I've read. So essentially, they measure, for example, like 3 seconds of song on the different frequencies, and they give us a value of loudness units. And this loudness unit sort of became a standard, which most songs which you hear on Spotify are like limited to. So if you have like a very dynamic jazz records with a lot of like quiet parts and a lot of like some loud parts, it will be pushed up. Mm-hmm. If you have a like really loud techno track which has like, I don't know, like 9 LUFS, it's gonna be pushed down. It was done for the sake of consumer, which makes complete sense to me. And I think the biggest problem is what the streaming services don't really disclose how they do that, and they all have different numbers of those LUFS. So your track on different streaming services may sound a little bit different. So one of the latest roles of mastering engineer is to create this master so it would sound roughly the same and would be competitive on all of those streaming services as well. So essentially loudness units are like arbitrary. It's just like a pressure or like a signal pressure on a certain how do you call it? Like certain time frame or whatever. Sorry, my English is lacking at the moment.
No, you're totally good.
Yeah, so
it's a very nuanced point you're trying to deliver.
Yeah, so and I've heard a lot of master engineers really don't care about this stuff, especially the ones which came from like the olden days, and they still make the track to like 0, and they still try to make it good without much consideration how it's going to sound on streaming services. But I think it's getting more important day by day, because that's where everyone is getting their music from. That's becoming like more of a concern for the mastering engineers, especially like younger ones who had no experience mastering for vinyl and other stuff. So yeah, I'm not sure if it explains the loudness and answers your question. So let me know if not.
I think I've understood it a bit better than I did. One problem I've always had is that, like, because I do YouTube, like, I've always just kind of guessed that, like, before I got like a mic preamp, I used to do all my mic processing through Ableton, and I used to basically do all the mix down when I was shooting the video. All of the audio was essentially mixed down in Ableton, and I would always just try and get it as close to zero as possible, because I just thought, well, that's going to be loud enough, and I obviously don't want to go louder than that. But a couple of times people have put comments in saying, your videos are too loud, turn them down. And I'm like, but surely I'm at zero. Like, surely that's fine. And then I looked it up, and I think that, like, I was just sort of curious, you know, what are like broadcasting level standards? Because YouTube is essentially a television platform. It's not,
YouTube
I mean, it's a music platform as well now, but like,
Negative
so
13.
I was looking at, and like, you know, some standards are like as quiet as like -12, as the loudest part for like television, for like mainstream television. And I was thinking, surely that's so quiet. Like, so anyway, I mean, basically, is going to zero on YouTube like really that dangerous?
Well, it's kind of like what metering are you using? Because like different, like, I guess I was taught using loss integrated, which YouTube normalizes to -13 loss integrated, which is an average of the loudness across an entire track or whatever. That's just a way of like, okay, I don't really need to clarify that point. That's pretty fair. So, I'm trying to think if where to go past that. I feel like that might be succinct enough.
And so is YouTube doing some processing after it's uploaded in order to get it within their own standards?
I think that they do. I think that anything that is louder gets dropped down, but because it was louder, everything just feels a lot more like squeezed and unpleasant to listen to because it was like louder than it needed to be or whatever. So like you're basically forfeiting dynamic range up front, and it's kind of claustrophobic. Whereas like if you're doing specified targeting to that level that you know that they're going to normalize to, then you're maximizing the amount of dynamic range that you get.
So for a mix, how many dB should it be before you pass it on to a mastering engineer?
This is again a metering. There are different metering things that I'm trying to think, what was the name of the free one? I use Insight 2 by Isotope.
Is there no like universal, like if this is -10 dB, it's -10 dB period? Or is there anything you can like look at it on and this will be -10 dB?
There are different dBs is the terrible truth.
Okay.
Oh,
I didn't even know what
dB is a
LUFs were
relative.
until Aaron told me about them. I was like, LUFs?
I never heard of that before. Yeah.
Yeah, so dB is a relative scale. Just
Yeah.
one thing. It's like
So if you're in Ableton and you have a -dB, what does that mean?
you have one -dB FS full scale. So that means your audio card like can't go more than like 0 dB. So and every audio card, every audio interface has this sort of 0 dB at their own level. Whatever they are kind of putting it out, it can be like 20 dBu, and dBu.
So hold on, does that mean that it's not relative to Ableton, it's relative to your audio card?
Yes. So it's sort of like 0 dB is where we have this yardstick, where everyone's card sort of chokes. And it can be a different dBu, and dBu is essentially voltage, which comes out of your jack outside. And it can be different because decks are, I think, like on a 6-volt power rails, I think. So it doesn't, and 6 volts is about, I would say like about about 8 dB. So essentially, when you like playing really loud, you have, sorry, let me go back a little bit. So
Totally
your
good.
audio card needs amplification after you decode digital into analog. And that's what's going on in your audio card. And this amplification is sort of what kind of makes audio interfaces different. All this stuff around the digital to audio converters. And the cost of all this audio interfaces is different because you have a lot of different approaches, how you amplify this, how you translate this digital signal into analog, and how it goes out to your monitors, right? How it goes out of your jack. So when you say 0 dB, this means that's the point where my audio card will just choke. Audio interface will choke. And all the audio cards sort of translate this into Ableton. So with your audio card, it can be like 24 dBu. We can translate to volts. It's like 14 volts. Sorry, it doesn't really matter. But essentially, it comes from the old days because you had a limit. It's like plus 4 dB, where distortion starts on a tape, for example, or in the amplification circuits of your tape recorder. And with audio card, it all changed. Like 0 dB became like minus 24 dBFS. So your card 0 is what kind of universal points of choking. So you don't go up like more than that. But there's another reason not to go to 0 and go rather like minus 1, which is much better, is because like if you imagine like a wave file, which just contains the points through which points the wave goes through. So it doesn't kind of draw a wave inside the file, right? It just has points which are translated into wave mathematically inside. So if it happens with the lower bit rates and the lower sample rates, sometimes mistakes happen and this math jumps over 0 when it's translated to like on some other computer. So what you usually do to avoid these peaks, you go minus 1 or like minus 1.1, whatever your magical number is, just to make sure when this file, which is put onto Spotify in imperfect file, when it's encoded and decoded, then it doesn't jump more than 0 because it mathematically kind of predicts how the wave goes.
Will this still happen with a limiter if you're using a limiter too?
You need a true peak limiter.
Yes, true peak limiter is what you need. It sort of calculates all this stuff, and I usually use just built-in limiter. I know a lot of people give shit to Ableton limiter or whatever, but I don't think that's the case. The problem, I think, is oversampling, which is not available on the Ableton. But if you turn your audio card or audio interface to work with like 192 sample rates, it's precise enough to catch all the true peaks and make your track like perfectly fine with minus 1 true peak dB.
So you suggest that we record with 192 instead of 24 or 48?
Well, that's what makes more precise recording. Like whether you do this or not, a lot of people have different opinions. When I master, I go into 192 just because I think the math is just more precise. And a lot of people don't do that. A lot of master engineers say that they don't convert file. For example, if you send them like 44.1, they usually give you 44.1 back, just because to avoid this mathematical conversion when it converts to 192. I don't hear any difference. It goes through my analog stack anyway, so I play it and I record with whatever quality I have in, and Ableton limiter, for example, works much better if you have like higher sample rate. If your computer can pull it off, I would suggest to do that because it's going to be much more precise.
Basically, what you're doing is you're gaining resolution for your processing.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's basically, well, I mean, I don't really think I need to say more. I feel like that's pretty good. Gaining
So even if you
resolution-
start with 44 and you convert it to 192, you're still getting a
well,
higher
you're
resolution.
you're converting your processing. Like as a mastering engineer, you'd be gaining resolution of like your actual processors or whatever. It's not that, like basically how you're manipulating what you've been sent, you're going to have more fine control. I think that's.
It's just the computer is. It's getting harder for a computer because you have a lot more points which describe your waves, like the sine wave. You have this which translated from analog, for example, when you play guitar, you have like a voltage going up and down, and analog voltage essentially is like it's like infinite precision, right? Because it's analog. With digital, what digital does is that it sees its wave and it puts points which describe this your wave which you were playing. Like it describes this sine wave. So what you do with higher sample rates, as been mentioned, is that you increase the resolution. The more points are just like, let's assume like it's like 3 points per wave on this like lowest resolution, and then it's like a lot more points, which allows your computer to draw this sine wave more precisely. But it requires processing power for it to work. That's why your computer is like can get like hot while doing that. And sometimes it's just impossible when you mix in like I don't know, like 30 tracks with like 192 or even 96. It just goes down.
I think a helpful thing to address would be that there is a lot of depreciating returns that is going to be gained from the amount of like time you will hemorrhage dealing with a higher resolution. And like on your computer, if your system does not handle that, then it's not going to be worth your time to deal with that because it's not going to make that big of a difference.
Yeah, and honestly, if you'll use a lot of plugins or like any plugins which you buy, which are paid and not stock, a lot of them have oversampling, so-called. So what they do is they recalculate your waves, which comes into the plugin, into a much higher resolution. So they inside could put math on it with a lot more precision, and then they downsample back to the original simple rate you've played to. So conversion happens inside the plugins. So you don't have to like pull all the processing power from your computer. It just uses for the small plugin which you put on a side in your processing chain. So if I remember original question, like to what level do you master? I would suggest -1 dBFS. dBFS full scale. Like
Actually, the original question was, what level should the mix be before you give it to a mastering engineer?
Oh, again, like -3, -6, -12, whatever. Because as a master engineer, I will pull it up to -1 anyway. So it doesn't matter. It really again, this comes from the analog world, right? Because you want it not when you pass your mix to the master engineer, you don't want this hiss coming from the tape to be really heard. So what you were trying, and what the difference was during the analog days, I have like a 16-track 2-inch recording machine, like tape machine in the corner, and I've actually tried and experimented with it. So what's happening is with digital, it opened a lot of possibilities for you to process signal after you recorded it, because this dynamic range, this noise to signal ratio became this really huge, because the noise of the audio interface is really, really, really low. You don't have to worry about it. With tape, you hear a lot of hiss from tape, because that's what tape how tape works. Because you kind of have to like excite the magnetical elements in the tape before you can actually record them. They need to kind of be excited, and that's where tape hiss is coming from. So what recording engineers did, they committed to the tape, meaning that they've put all the instruments, all microphones through processing before it's recorded to the tape. So they needed to record it up to a level where they have this clean recording without much distortion. And keep in mind, like, this is tape and this is analog kind of circuits working. So these circuits kind of bring their own character to this, and they can distort like up to, I don't know, like up to certain levels. Like different tape machines have their own levels. And also the tape can handle more than anything, more than particular level that you record to it. So that's where tape distortion comes from. The specific effect, which I personally love when I put a synth through a cassette tape, or I have this module with cassette inside, and you push the level too high into it and it starts to distort and create this uneven harmonics in the signal. It starts to sound distorted, and it's really pleasant, at least for myself. So recording engineers had to find this level where they recorded loud enough to not to distort. Loud enough not to hear the noise floor like really clearly. So when you push it up during mixing phase, you kind of don't hear the noise floor, and it shouldn't be too high so you wouldn't distort it on the tape when you pull it off during mixing phase. So this is where this kind of myth, or rather like persistent kind of common knowledge comes from, in my opinion, from the analog days. Nowadays, don't worry about it. Just make sure it doesn't clip, and you're good. So it's -3, -6, -12. It doesn't really matter.
So what do you think of this new, I don't know, theory that's come out of the clip to zero? I don't know if you've seen Bathymetric's video on it, but there's a few people who are actually saying that the wisdom of don't redline is actually not ideal for electronic dance music kind of genres.
Can you give us the gist of it? So you sort of can.
So the idea is when you're summing channels together, right? We've got a kick and a snare, and then we're throwing hats on top of that, right? You've got frequencies that are going to sum together and are going to peak.
Yeah.
So the idea is, instead of trying to bring those down with a limiter, using a hard clipper to just kind of chop those peaks off, and then as you're summing all of your channels together, at each point there's these various different frequencies that are going to cause peaks that are going to cause redlining. And instead of going trying to fix that, just leaning into it and using your clipper to kind of chop off those peaks. The idea isn't to redline the whole signal, right? Because then you get distortion and bad sounds. But by clipping these kind of transient peaks, you're actually able to push things into the kind of mastering limiter more, because you're not getting these random peaks that would trigger your limiter to kind of crush the rest of your music.
Right. So I haven't watched the video, and I might have misunderstood what's going on, but I might be, as far as I understand, what we're talking about is the slight saturation when you clip the wave by pushing it into the kind of limits of what the analog can handle. And I think saturation is a wonderful tool. It absolutely can and should be used. At least I use it all the time. What happens is, when you have like a sine wave, when you push it into zero, it just clips at the top And what you get is essentially the square wave instead of a sine wave when it clips. And this square wave, as we probably know from synths, produces harmonics, a range of harmonics, like first, second, and so on. Second, third, and so on. So what happens when you push your channels a bit too high, they start to clip at some points, and the point where they clip adds harmonical content on top of this clipping of the wave. So I don't think it's like particularly bad, just use your ears. Because, for example, on bass or on kick or somewhere in the range of, I don't know, like 1K, these harmonics can sound really good and can brighten your mix a little bit. You might even not even need to use the EQ to push up highs a little bit. You just push the signal a bit into the limits of your hardware or audio card or software when we're talking about summing, and it clips the sine wave a little bit, creates this harmonic, and might sound nice. So I embrace it to try. I usually use analog for this because it distorts much nicer. I read engineers use the limits of audio converters, of signal converters, to push the signal a little bit more into them to get this nice clipping. Because audio converters, as I mentioned, is a sort of an analog circuits which converge into this analog to digital converter. So it may happen on different stages. It may happen in the analog phase when it clips. It may happen on the actual converter, and you really don't know unless you try and unless you hear it. So I suggest highly you do that. Just push into 0, see what happens, see if it brightens your mix. Don't be afraid to push into kind of 0. You can limit it after that easily. So to me, it seems like a reasonable thing. I don't know if there are any other points on that.
I cannot speak to this. It's not something that I've ever tried.
Yeah, definitely try that. I think it's completely fine. But again, like Ableton, for example, if I'm not mistaken, is 32-bit math, which means when you sum channel together, clipping them is nearly impossible because you need to go really, really high in level for it to clip. What's clipping is the master because it goes more than 0, and your digital audio interface just can't produce the sound. So what you hear from your speakers when it starts to distort is actually the like digital to audio conversion in your interface. So if you, for example, have this unique way to plug your headphones into the Ableton, no distortion will happen because it uses 32-bit math, and the dynamic range is huge. It goes to like 200 or something dB. Like I don't really remember which is the number, but it really has this huge dynamic range. So clipping is not happening when you sum channels unless you specifically use some plugins which replicates analog and then they kind of clips on their own. But your master channel is clipping, and I would assume the conversion is clipping rather than anything else.
I have a question. Are your I guess the resolution of your math is limited to what card you're using?
Yes, but most cards like 24 bits.
Like if you're on a laptop and you're not on a interface or whatever, then you're limited to. I'm trying to think. I'm actually not sure about this at the moment.
No, internal conversion inside the DAW happens on the terms of DAW. So if it uses 32-bit, it doesn't really matter which sample rates or bit
It's
rate
just what
you
you're
use in the audio
monitoring.
card.
You're right.
Yeah, so just the monitoring is what happens. So it pushes this 2-track onto your speakers, and that's where distortion may happen if you push it a bit too hard. But again, can you record this distortion? I guess. Do you really need it? Hard to say. But I highly encourage you to utilize saturation via plugins or hardware and experiment with this. I think it can sound wonderful. I, for example, try not to use compression when I'm mastering. It sounded dumb, sorry. I use compression only to fix certain problems during mastering. So I'm not trying to throw compression just for the sake of compression, because sometimes the track doesn't really need compression because it will go down in the streaming services if you compress it too much. So I try to avoid compression in this way, but instead of that, what I'm usually doing is I have this passive EQ, which is sort of an evolution of Pultec. What I'm usually trying, and it's wonderful because you have this output stage with tubes and transformer, which saturates really nicely if you push the signal a bit too hard into it.
For
So
sure.
what I usually do is that I send the signal a bit more than EQ can handle, and the saturation happens in the hardware. But finding a good hardware which saturates nicely is kind of a very personal thing. So don't really kind of get it as a follow-up. But there are a lot of plugins which you can use and saturate separate channels.
I have a question. Just going back to you were saying about mastering things to -1. Whenever I've done this in Ableton, and I like exploring trying to master things myself. That kind of mix at that level, or that master at that level, that always gets penalised on something like the loudness penalty thing that you shared, Nick. Like for being going over. And if I look at that in something like Ozone, it goes way above -14 LUFS. So I just wonder, like, but then a master like that, I could take that to a club or play that on a club sound system, and it seems perfectly loud enough against other tracks, and perfectly fine when I listen to it on speakers and stuff like that. So when do I need to worry about that? Do I need to worry about the fact that, like, it sounds okay when I'm hearing it, but then if I put it on a streaming service, it's going to be penalized and not sound as good? Or should I just master to -1 and not worry about it and just put it anywhere?
Well, -1 is just a peak loudness, right?
It's
Just
it's not the average.
Yeah, so what you kind of need to look for is the average loudness, which is measured in LUFS.
Loss integrated.
Yeah, so different streaming services use different LUFS, and you really can't do much about it unless you're like changing the arrangement, because if some track is like really loud, then it goes quieter, then it goes really loud, the number will be acceptable. But if it's like all the kick blasting through the track and a lot of bass, you really can do nothing about those LUFS. And especially considering all the similar tracks, you will probably be competing with all the similar tracks with similar styles. And if they are similar styles, they will be sort of equally loud in a way.
Will they be equally penalized, do you think, then?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So none of the techno, like hard, I've mastered several techno records which are like really hard fucking UK techno underground. And they never go less than -10. Like it's impossible because it's just fucking blasting a lot of like wall of sound.
Yeah.
So, and similar tracks will be on streaming services similarly penalized.
Okay.
But if you're playing them in a club, you can turn it up, right? You can just turn the knob
Yeah,
up
yeah.
and it will just go to the whatever loudness you feel it needs to be. And people can actually do the same when they listen in on streaming, right? If something is not loud enough. For example, there's like extremely popular track by Post Malone. Sorry, what was it? Sunflower, which was in a Spider-Man. And I like this track. And every time it goes on in my list, I always want to turn it up because it's just really quiet. I don't know what happened there during mastering phase or during mixing. I can't get it really because it just sounds really quiet in comparison with everything else in my list.
It's like classical music as well. I always find the same thing listening to like classicals because the dynamic range is so great, and it's always too quiet on like even on the radio and stuff like that compared to commercially produced like pop music nowadays. You know.
Yeah, well, loudness wars is still a thing, right? It's just changed the medium. It just changed from going like printing on CDs to having the streaming services, and mastering engineers are still trying to make it as loud as possible if artists really wants it. And you go into like finding tricks to actually do that. But you can't really win much there unless you change the arrangements. So I don't think you should worry too much about this.
There's something I want to say about, I guess, disparities in loudness averages for different genres or whatever. Generally speaking, electronic producers get to specify a specific, they have so much control over like the space that each element takes up in a mix that you don't have to make as much room through other means. It's already very precise. So you can be very, very, very bold. Whereas with the classical situation, you have so many different elements that you're trying to find space for. And so that is why you go quieter, is like you don't have the same amount of precision control over each voice. So you just kind of like back off and let it breathe.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also viable for, you have to consider who's mastering classical music, right? Unlikely, like techno, like master engineers specializing in techno are mastering classical music, so it's very unlikely. So they have their own levels they are used to, and that's what they try to do. And also, if you consider like some, I don't know, violin performances, like I don't know, Vivaldi, artist really cares and really wants this dynamic he can pull from his instruments to be translated, so you don't really compress it to make quiet part louder, so it stays, this dynamic range stays true to what artist is playing, and that's, I think, is the kind of the difference as well.
Like the source, like the performer
absolutely.
themselves. Yeah, completely. Great, thank you.
Something else to keep in mind is that an element that not many mixers are considering is their noise floor. Like when I receive mixes, often I'll denoise because there's often like, basically when you're cranking up, like once you're hitting the limiter or whatever, all this like, that is what's erasing space for your other instruments, is that noise gets louder and more present, and then you start to lose clarity, or it's just polluting each voice or whatever. And so what you do is you find dynamic range by looking at your noise floor and going down, trying to erase and then pumping up. Like you don't try and look higher than what, there's no point, because you're just going to alias. So the only thing to focus on is like getting your self noise as low as you can.
I have this experience with some digital modules I use in the Eurorack. Like, for example, and it's a question of gain staging, I think, more than anything. So, for
Really
example,
solid.
like Beats, which is mutable module, it produces a lot of digital noise. So what you have to do to avoid it, you have to push higher signal into it and make the module itself a little bit quieter because it can handle this. It has this headroom a little bit. So I think gain staging is a kind of biggest not a problem really. It's just something that it's a bit difficult to explain, and it's a bit of like convoluted concept to wrap your head around sometimes, because you have a lot of things in your chain, and it's sometimes really unclear where this shit is coming, like creeping into the mix. So yeah, I completely agree.
Takes an ungodly amount of diligence to address that. Yeah, I agree.
What tools are good for that? Aaron?
Ears.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a good plugin for denoising?
I use Isotope RX. There's a spectral denoise. I think it's what it's called, DAW.
Yes, spectral denoise, exactly. I use the same thing, but I have some hardware which produce this sort of hiss on top.
There's something I want to.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I wouldn't rely super heavily on denoising as a mixer. I would rely on your ears and gain staging as a mixer. As a mastering engineer, where everything's been kind of like baked, then you kind of like, that's when you start using denoising or whatever, I would say. But like, ideally you're going to be very mindful. Ideally the mixer is going to be very mindful of their noise. Well, as the recording, sorry, not their mixing. The recording engineer or the producer.
Yes. I also tend to avoid using spectral denoise if I can, because I have a kind of, I feel it cuts a little bit of the high frequencies sometimes, which are not desirable.
I totally
However
agree.
you kind of set it up, it sometimes just sounds better with a little bit hiss under it. So it's usually up to the artist. I send them
It's a taste thing.
it. Yeah, exactly. Someone really likes this kind of vinyl crackling and tape hiss under the track. Someone really wants to avoid it, so I think it's up to an artist.
Hey Nick, do you have any Ableton live sets that you'd be willing to share for mastering? They have mastering templates.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm very open. Like I'm never shy of sharing whatever I've been doing. So I'm happy to send you whatever you guys want.
Maybe that might be a good time to sort of steer, because that was in my notes. Maybe we could sort of steer it in that direction now, unless anyone else has got any other questions, or indeed want to take a break. Hi, Josh.
I wanted to say hello. And is anybody here old enough to remember actual digital noise? Like what it sounded like before somebody modeled, digitally modeled analog noise? Because it used to be, if you clipped, like when I did mastering a long time, when I started, if you clipped going to, from DAT, going to DAT from say Ampex tape, it just turned into like inaudible hiss and nonsense. Like it wasn't a good sound. It wasn't even usable for like glitching. Like, does anybody remember like digital noise from back in the day?
From what?
2000. It's probably 2001.
Like,
2002.
what's the source of the digital noise? Are you talking about digital artifacting?
Dates.
Clip?
I'm talking about like mixing
Because
to DAT
it's the
tape.
same.
Yeah, that
Like
tape.
mastering.
Oh, right, no.
It was awful. It was now you clip, and there's like a modeling of the noise that used to be made by tape. But if you clipped when you were bouncing down to DAT, it was cacophonous. It was horrible. Like I said, it wasn't even cool. Like not even like Oval or somebody would like that.
Yeah,
that.
maybe you should expand on what ADAT was, because I don't think a lot of people even know, because it transitions so quickly.
I think.
Well, ADAT I never fucked with. Как ты, братуха? were you podcasting? Where are you casting from?
Me?
Yeah. Yeah. Or
You mean the country? The what
yeah.
is it?
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm from Latvia.
Latvia. I'm thinking of moving to Latvia. Fakes.
Oh, really? Please come. Wonderful
Mikhail Tal's
country.
my hero, and my wife is actually Latvian.
Oh, excellent.
And her father was a refugee from the first time there was refugees. Well, not even the first time. Yeah, the first time there was refugees from the SSSR, and so we actually can get she can become a Latvian citizen, and she could probably finesse me into some kind of visa. Your name is just straight up Yuzhny, which is why I ask. I mean,
Yeah, I'm Russian.
Yeah.
But I live in Latvia. I'm Latvian, but my kind of ancestry are Russian. I was born in the USSR, but I lived my whole
the
life.
Caucasus, the Caucasus.
No. I'm like just a regular kind of Russian. I guess.
Yeah. That nobody else gets that. But yeah, my family all have EV names because they're from the Caucasus originally. But anyway, I wasn't talking about ADAT. I was talking about, okay, like initially when you mastered, not initially, obviously. I'm not talking about, going down to Kingston and print dub plate. I don't even know how to do that. Like, because you used to have to actually master different for digital and analog formats. And to be like a mastering guy, you had to have perfect pitch and hear from here to here. And there was usually like really big studios, like the Sound Factory had a recording studio and a mastering studio, or there were plenty of studios that just did mastering. West Side Music was one of the great ones in Manhattan. But it was just a totally different process. You would first mix down to stereo left and right, usually DAT from whatever 24-inch, half-inch, 1-inch tape. Usually you get 8 tracks per half-inch, and you'd have to bounce down if you wanted to add more stuff. And then you took that DAT to somebody like Alan Duchesne, who was one of my favorite mastering guys in the world, and he would master it for either vinyl or CD, or there wasn't really streaming, or MP3 was just kind of like it was like a vehicle for theft. That's all it was at the time. But yeah, it was an incredibly different process. I still get crap from people. Like the first time I mastered, I mixed down to MP3, and then I took the MP3 and put it into like Slate, whatever I was using at the time, and they were like, "What the?" Because it should be 2 different processes. A lot of people still think that. A lot of people think the artist shouldn't even be in the room when you master or mix in some cases. But I could tell you more about that kind of mastering than I could about a studio just gave me an Isotope 1-year subscription, and I'm just like, it's hardly a fact. It's just like, what's that thing, Neutron Pro, and like you got a demo ready recording. Like quite literally, you have a demo ready recording. And I'd love to learn more about that in Ableton, in whatever. I like to use Reason still, because I'm not sophisto like you guys, but
Started on Reason.
I'm sorry.
It's 30% off.
I started on Reason.
Yeah,
I started on Reason as well before I got into Ableton.
I did too.
Hell yeah.
30% off at the moment. I'm thinking of maybe getting 12. It's £133 to upgrade to 12 with 30% off.
Their main spokesperson just crossed the Rubicon. I don't know if you know who July is, spelled funny, Kickback Couture. You know who that is? She's like she does a lot of their those subscription service sound pack things, and she does a lot of the, like if a rack extension will drop, she'll do an ad on it, and she just made a YouTube video that was like, fuck those guys. And I think that might be why. they're offering discounts, but I still think it's a great program.
I do have, quietly have plans to revisit it for YouTube, because it was where I started my YouTube. But like
where I got into you, I've told you 100 times, was those a key glitch and auto glitch, and I used one like the other day on a mix.
That's going back
Yeah, it's still good stuff, man.
like 10 years.
Yeah, but I was using it on recordings from like a S1100 or something, so it didn't. But yeah, but that was how I first got into YouTube as well. I think it's a great program, but I think the direction they're gone in is just some serious, like, what are they, Swedish? No, that is some serious, far west economics.
I have a question about the different DAWs in terms of sound quality, and maybe this is sort of jumping a gun a bit. I know, Ned, you've got some stuff about Ableton mastering, but I came from Logic, and Logic, and the thing that put me off Ableton for a while is it had a very bad reputation for having a poor quality of sound. Now, I can hear differences between older projects in Logic that do sound crisper than Ableton does. Is there any reason for that, or is that just a load of kind of myth and folklore?
I have something to say about this. It is, in my experience, in my, I guess, what's the word, in my instruction or curriculum, was taught that Ableton's dithering is not great. It's better to use Isotope's maximizer dithering. That's what I use at the moment, but I rarely dither through Ableton. So I operate in two legs. I will do my, I guess, I'll process, do my mastering process or whatever, and leave out the limiting till after. Like I'll port that out. I'll save that as like basically the my pre-loud print, and then I can load that into Ozone and only worry about the limiting, and maybe address some like things such as like resonance buildups, using the spectral shaper or whatever. Like if something now that it is louder, like now that you are limiting it, you're going to like add some more processing in addition. But the thing is, you limit to, I guess, different. It just makes it easier to give the client platform-specific files. Like you don't have to keep changing. Sorry, I'm rambling. Go ahead.
That's fine. So there is a tone to the DAW. I think that's the question I'm asking. And even for my rubbish hearing, I can tell the difference there. And you say it comes down to dithering. So that's the thing. Is this just a taste thing, or is Ableton actually lacking in some way here? Maybe
I actually wanted to contribute to this as well, because
Go ahead.
as far as I'm aware, when you turn the warp on, even if you're not doing anything with the audio file, and by default, when you import into Ableton, warp is on. So even if you don't do anything with warp, it degrades the audio in some way. So I've seen some posts that summing in Ableton is completely fine, but the problem comes from the warping.
Okay.
And I'm honestly, for me, dithering is like a black hole. Like I know what it is, I know how it works, but for me it's a fucking black hole. I have no idea how it works, how the math works, and so on. I don't hear particular difference, and if you record it 32 bits, like, dude, there's no dithering happening, isn't it? Like if you output 32 bits, because there's no math that kind of comes into play. I might be wrong, so please correct me if about this, because for me it's really fucking black hole.
I didn't even know that dithering was an option until I just looked. I don't think I've ever turned it on. Well, in fact, I think it probably is on anyway when I export, but
it's defaulted to be on. Yeah,
I know more about black holes than I do about dithering, actually. And I know nothing
about
about
black hole, haven't they? That's going wildly off topic. So bit depth I get. I mean, obviously you can't see this, but no dither, rectangular, triangular, power R1, power R2, power R3.
What does that all mean? That'd be good.
Yeah. But maybe
this is too nuanced of a conversation than I'm prepared to have in this moment. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, maybe we could move on then to looking at some of Nick's Ableton stock processing for mastering, because I think that I think that there's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to get something out of that for sure, especially people who use Ableton and watch my videos. I reckon there's definitely, because it's kind of we've been having conversations along the way about doing it yourself versus getting a pro. I mean, I'll always hire a pro, but there might just be times when actually I just want to stick something on SoundCloud just to try it out with an online audience, but I want it to sound half decent. So yeah, I mean, if you're able to go into that,
we take 5, Duncan. I was just waiting for an
absolutely
opportunity for us to cut when I didn't want to chip in when you were talking.
No, it's fine. Yeah, everyone take 5. I'm going to get another beer anyway.
How's it going, Ed?
Okay.
Good. Appreciate your time, Nick. You've been giving some valuable information.
Oh, thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Hopefully this information is at least partially true. We'll see in the comments.
I'm curious, since this is relative to mastering started in the analog world, what is the relevance of it in the digital world? If you get your mix right. Yeah.
Oh, I think it's still relevant because, again, the biggest value of mastering engineer is, I think, his ability to use tools to make records sound good and competitive on the streaming nowadays, especially. And I think one of the biggest values as well is that usually mastering engineer has, better than average setup of speakers and hardware, which...
Well, you bring up an interesting point, a mastering engineer who actually has all this stuff, but a lot of people probably are calling themselves mastering engineers. They're just using digital stuff and don't actually have a room and don't have is that true or not?
Well, I have no idea I have far from perfect room. If you look at my room, it's barely treated, but I have a good set of speakers which translates the kind of the sound.
What are those crazy speakers on the very outside?
Those are these local guys, Reflector Audio. Those are open baffle speakers. They really, really amazing set of speakers. Those small cubes is the new prototype they produced. I have on testing and considering buying. I'm usually using for mixing. I use Amphion's. You can see them out. So Amphion 218, but I have this on test. So yeah, my room is not perfect, but I happen to kind of be lucky with how bass translates in it, because it's usually the biggest problem. So I have a room which actually don't produce much problems in the lower end area. I feel if going back to master engineer, if it's true or not, I'm not sure if it's really important, to be frank. I think you can master on whatever if you know how it should sound on whatever you're using for mastering. As you mentioned, this Apple buds or whatever they called, I use them to test it as well, but mostly because I'm sometimes not sure if if I have too much high end, if it just sounds like squeaking, distorting shit on Apple Buds at some point. But other than that, I think you can use whatever you feel confident with. It's about being confident with your decisions during mastering. You have to be confident to hear distortion, if there is any. You have to be, especially if you use like analog gear, it sometimes distorts in a weird way, like a limiter or some stereo processing unit that I'm using. So you have to be
That's
confident.
interesting. Duncan brought up this point earlier. I'm not sure if I got a clear answer about like, at what point are you using your ears, and what point are you using the things you see, the monitors you see on the screen? Like if something sounds good but the meter says it doesn't, it's not right, or if something the meter says it's right but it doesn't sound good, which one do you go with?
I trust my ears more than stuff I see on a screen.
Yeah.
And the reason is, my job is not really to limit the artist with his choices. If he wants this bass to be blasted, to get this Windows off, it's fine with me. I just have to make sure it translates fine to anything you could listen on. And nowadays people just turn it on their phones without any headphones, which obviously don't have any bass. It can produce anything like under, I don't know, 100 hertz or something. And my decision is usually should I add some saturation to make it more clearly heard in 100, 120 hertz? So again, if you happen to be confident just making those decisions yourself, it's great. Do mastering yourself. But for example, a good example of kind of what master engineers are, or not master engineers, on artists or producers who want to do them themselves, kind of have to tackle on, is that you listen on your monitor and it sounds great. You get your headphones on and it sounds different. You get in a car and it sounds different. So if, for example, you have to address the problems you hear in your car, but you don't hear on your speakers, how do you do that? So in my opinion, it's best to learn the single set of speakers you have. And if it translates well on everything and artist is happy, just go with it.
One way that I've addressed it is, I mentioned that these Slate headphones, VSX, they model different speaker sets, or car speakers, and they model a club setting, and they model different studio speakers, and as well as different headphones. So you can mix you can test it on different setups virtually, and it cuts down on a lot of guesswork. At least it has for me.
Yeah, but which set do you trust? Which set tells you the truth? For example, you on one set, in one setting, you hear there's a build-up on, I don't know, 230 hertz. For example, on Amphion's I have, there's a pretty kind of high build-up, about 6 dB in 230 hertz area, which I don't hear on my main monitors, on the big ones. Where's the truth?
Well, for me, I try and get everything to sound good in the VSX, and then my last line of defense are the Apple earbuds. That's personally, that's how I do, because I feel like that's where most people are listening to the music. But
there's
I don't really know the
physicality
answer.
of a club,
Very good call.
club system. Those,
that's what I do as well. Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons I got these big ass speakers, is because they sound like a club speakers, because they use professional, how do you call it? Speakers? Do you call them speakers? The actual kind of
amps, speakers.
No, it uses professional amps as well. It's sort of like a club. So these things,
a horn.
These things are
Drivers,
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
these things are kind of from professional world. These are made for professional concert setting. And you have like this horn which produces high frequencies, the crossover point is quite high, and the bass is quite direct. So they don't really disperse the bass, and you can really feel it's on yourself. So you can really hear it rather than kind of feel it in the room, because mostly low end is the energy which you kind of feel. So I love these big speakers exactly because most of the stuff I master is electronic, so I want to kind of have this feeling of low end pushing into me, and have this feeling how it's gonna sound in a bigger speakers. But
Yeah.
check.
I was going to say, do you think it's important to test your mix on different speakers before you send it to mastering? Or if I think it sounds good here on my crap monitors and headphones,
Yeah.
I can send it to you.
That's a good approach. I was gonna say that back in the day, like I keep a jam box around, like a piece of shirt, Panasonic, I'm not gonna go get it, but it's got a cassette tape player, and if stuff sounds good on there, I know it's good enough. Or in my actually my car has pretty good sound, so I don't really trust that one.
So are you doing that before you send it off for mastering, or is that how you're checking your mastered mix? Do I need to, before I give it to a mastering engineer, check it on different speakers, or is that not really important?
Yeah, that's kind of like for final mix and mastering. That both are a good idea. Be like, there's that Cuban cat down in Florida who has $40,000 monitors in his studio, and that's cool. If I had that much money to blow, I'd probably have them, but they're not realistic, as something to what you said, and I think that's a good approach in either situation, mastering or mixing.
I think before you send it to master engineer, I think it's really worth checking on a lot of different sources, because to give you an example, like your speakers, for example, produce like 50 hertz perfectly well, and your kick sample is mostly in like 50, I don't know, like 30 to 60 hertz area, and you don't have this click on top of it. You don't have this clicking noise which goes into like further frequencies. So this shit won't be reproduced if you're listening on some crappy speakers which don't have bass. So you will just hear this instead of the kick. So
which is why that click is so important.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's what a bass drum is. It's just like I record a lot of trap for Chicago artists and Florida artists and whoever will pay me. I don't, I ain't partial, but they're like, why?
Money's money, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But like, I always, scoop the high pass filter at the bottom of the bass before I sidechain it, because that click, especially if you got 808s, that clicks the bass drum. That's all it is. It's a click.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sometimes in a mix, if you don't have enough kick, usually people go to like making it louder in low ends, but they really should focus on the click on this clicking sound rather than the low ends, because that's kind of where the dynamics and in your brain it converts automatically to being the kick drum, so it enhances in your brain significantly.
Hey Damon, do you ever use reference tracks?
Reference tracks?
Meaning like listening to like songs, how they sound on your different system, and then like you can kind of, if you pick a reference track that's similar to the sound of the track you're working on, you kind of can get an idea of where you're lacking or where you're in a good place, because you already know how that sound, like from somebody else's music that's done professionally or whatever,
right,
by another artist. How it sound, how it sounds good, because you're used to listening to it on your system,
right?
So if you listen to your music next to that, and there's different like software too that can kind of compare reference tracks to your tracks, so you can kind of see like the frequencies that they have compared to what you have. Like if you have too much low end, they don't, like, you can kind of see where you're kind of steering wrong with your mix. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally.
Do you guys have any suggestions as mastering engineers about reference tracks?
I
Do you ever use them,
rarely
or-
use them. I'm rarely given any reference tracks, to be frank. Sometimes I do, and I just compare the sound on Spotify, the energy, kind of. Sometimes the overall balance in the mix. Like for example, if the reference track is kind of less low end focused, then the track for master what I'm given, that's probably what I'm gonna refer to. Like lower the low end a little bit and emphasize the high end, but that's pretty much what I'm using it for.
You're muted, Chicken.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I like to use reference tracks as a guide for how much dynamic range my client is expecting.
I mean, if
Like
if you're having me record a disco track, like I'll compare it to some Gloria Gaynor shit. If somebody's making a trap record, I'm like, do you want to sound like Uzi Vert? You want it to sound like whatever? If it's a boom bap record, same thing. You want to sound like Wu-Tang? You want to sound like, but I think that's really important. There's a reason. There's a lot of reasons why those songs are hits. But as far as Isotope has that reference track program thing. I've never used that. I don't know if Ableton has that or anything else.
I think I might have seen what you're talking about, where it will kind of make an analysis.
Yeah.
Look at the EQ curve and then kind of match the EQ
convolution
curve
kind of thing
onto your mix. Yeah.
Speaking of reference tracks, I saw a video by this guy, Help Me Devon. He's an engineer, and he was talking about Lander, which initially I was kind of skeptical about, and he said he was kind of skeptical about it as well in his video. But one of the tricks he showed was, first off, he said it was kind of surprising how good their mastering was. He was surprised by it. But another use for it he suggested was to have it mastered, and then you could use your own song as a reference track and bring it into your DAW to see what you liked or didn't like about how they mastered the track. And then you could like apply it to like do it yourself on your own track. How do you guys feel about Lander for mastering? Or
yeah, this was something that was in the notes, like just like cloud-based services in general. Like, are they? Because I've never used one, but like I'm quite quick to dismiss and just sort of go, well, this is a load of snake oil nonsense. But yeah.
Sorry. I used Lander a couple of times just out of curiosity, but my DJ friends who's producing and like playing tracks occasionally have used it extensively, just because it's really available and gives you different kind of flavors of your track right away. And I'm honestly, my kind of line of work as a designer is, I'm a user experience designer as well. And I've been doing this for 20 years, almost 20 years. And we are working on a project with some AI, algorithmical sort of things connected. And I have strong belief, to be frank, that this whole Lander concept will be the future. Even if it's now kind of can't really beat the master engineer, I feel mastering is so much just a taste. So if you like what Lander gives you on the output, just go with it. Like, you don't really need to worry about should I hire an engineer, would he be better? I, for example, like before I started to do mastering commercially, I was mostly working with like my friends who were producing music, and I've just had an opportunity to mix and master for them. I had a studio, I had some gear, which I really enjoyed using. So before I went and asked money for it, I've spent like, well, fair amounts of time sending mixes to Abbey Road, where they kind of put through tracks. You can sort of order mastering through the websites, and I paid them to receive mastering from Abbey Road engineers. And I gave artists kind of two versions, mine and Abbey Road. And as soon as I kind of received positive feedback from mixes or masters I heard about like which I did, I decided I can start kind of charging for it. And that's how my kind of professional mastering started.
That's a great fucking idea. That's a great idea.
So and honestly, a lot of these ideas come from design world, right? So you want this measurable response to your design ideas. So and I don't think you should worry if master engineer will do a better job. Like, not a lot of people listening on Spotify will distinguish like can it sound better. I think the most important part is that you think it sounds better.
What's your opinion about your people who extensively have used the Lander? You said you have some friends who extensively use Lander. What's your opinion about their mastering? Or have you heard their tracks?
It's difficult to say unless you try to master it yourself. Like, can you do better? Well, probably.
You would have said it was good if it was any good. They're your friends.
It's not going to make a shit track better, though, is it? That's the thing.
Absolutely.
Like, it's the music at the end of the day, isn't it? Like,
exactly.
If that's no good, no amount of mastering or
but it's like the TV, which
is an Americanism. You can't polish a turd.
Yeah.
But again,
well,
it's
assuming your mix is good.
Yeah, to me, it's like finding a good TV and being in a store, right? You see all those TVs and you can select the one which is brightest or the better. But once you take it out and bring it to your home, like, can you really distinguish, was it even better than any others of those TVs? So I think the biggest value that Lander brings is that it gives you different flavors immediately. With Master Engineer, it's a step-by-step process. Like, it gives you a master which he thinks is perfect, and you give comments or notes, and only then I, for example, go back and revise the master and give the new version. While Lander really can tackle a lot of different flavors for you in like 30 seconds or something. And you definitely can use it as a reference track for master engineer. Like, can you do it any better? But you will pay money to a master engineer to even try that. So if it already sounds better to you, why waste all that money? Just buy yourself something else. I don't know.
There's another thing I was thinking about while we were on break, is that there's a conversation that is had between a mastering engineer and their client that can lead them to better understand things that they are doing that is problematic, or that are problematic. So I feel like what I would say is that Lander is exciting, like AI is exciting for automating the process, but it's not going to provide the same level of like notes as a really, really good, dutiful mastering engineer.
Then I bet the better question would be, how do you know if you get a good what are some questions to find out if you're getting a good mastering engineer?
Here's another analogy. It's kind of like self-therapy versus in-person therapy. Like having someone who's like listening to you and like talking to you rather than just like your own like.
Yeah, it gives you perspective, right, on the things you've previously
it must be
thought
like
about.
feedback. It's just
right.
It's not even
classic
saying it's self-talk
of-
generally. It's a rip-off.
So do you have a way to screen mastering engineers? Like, do you have any suggestions to like, what are some questions you could ask so you know you have a good mastering engineer?
Well, if they're willing to like, I'm always willing to give notes back to a client for free, like just to listen, lend an ear or whatever. There are like phases of my life where I will be like not engaged in mastering or whatever because I do other things. But like when I'm like in that zone and like I'm good to like when I'm not doing other things, I am more than willing to lend an ear and say what I would change about the mix from the mix standpoint, because there's a great deal of latitude of control that is lost once you print the mix and send off to a mastering engineer. Generally, I try and send at least one set of notes for like all the tracks and have them address those issues in whatever manner they see fit to do so before they send the file back to me.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys have, or both of you have a way to get in touch with you if we wanted to utilize your services?
Yeah, I guess I have not put the mastering on the website, but I do have a website. It's just aaronwharton.com.
I'll be putting as much information as I can in the video description when it goes live, because there's I haven't been watching the chat, but I've had a quick look on the break and I can see that there's loads of stuff in there. So I've got a question, which I think is a bit of a classic. Like, have you ever sort of been sent something and you've been like, you've had to send it back and say, sorry, I literally can't do anything to that. Like it's shit. Well, not shit. you can't, it's like, I'm really sorry, but you have no idea what you're doing. I can't
Absolutely.
work on this.
That's fair. That is fair.
You caused my ear to bleed.
I would never tell that to a client, but
Yeah, but you
It
can
is
tell it to
true.
me.
There's that one. There's that one. You haven't yet, but there was a like this reggae artist in New York called Rocker T, and okay, he was white. All right, that's cool. Whatever, you like a style of music, that's fine. But then, like, I listened to the record, and he's like, you know, chanting in patois and talking about Jah and Rastafari and stuff like that. And he has this beautiful singing voice, but the music was crap. The band was crap. It was cultural inappropriation. I had no choice but to be like, dude, your last name's fucking Sorensen. Go make a metal record. Go make a fucking white power metal record. But like,
And this is maybe more a stylistic choice rather than like a mixed choice. Maybe.
but
I
yeah,
was
but
just
I'm
thinking,
just
like,
saying,
have you ever sort of been sent something where it's just kind of like, it's at like 10 dB above zero?
sure, I've gotten sent tracks where they put bass on everything, where even the hi-hats.
yeah,
You know, and like, there's like, take the bass off and send it back to me. This is,
yeah, but that's a producer talking in you, right? That's not the master engineer in a way, because you kind of feel this choice was inappropriate or unnecessary, and that's a producer in you, I think, bringing the voice to this. Because I would like I've been very judgmental towards music. I grew up with a lot of electronica stuff like Ethics Twin, like Square Pusher, Boards of Canada, Orbital, and a lot of kind of
you're with friends.
yeah, and
I think you'd really, really like my YouTube channel.
yeah, that's why I like your
That's
YouTube
right.
channel. I actually like that's what I started when I started to like view all your videos because they were completely insane. The approach to producing was absolutely marvelous. Like I could never imagine these things can be done. But yeah, back to my point.
Thanks.
I've spent a good deal of time to kind of learn not to be judgmental to whatever music I've been sent. And at some point, I even stopped listening during work, like anything, like for a couple of years, just because I decided to sort of explore a lot of other genres to be more open towards, and I've honestly learned not to be judgmental towards like any kind of music I have to work with. My goal is to just bring the best parts, tone down the worst parts, and kind of be helpful in a way.
So you've really never got anything that you really just couldn't do anything with?
Well,
you
yeah,
feel like you
I've
can
sent,
all okay.
yeah, I've sent like masters instead of mixes with like a lot of clipping instruments and a lot of compression. That's barely like the probably the worst thing I've been sent in on a technical level. And then I just address this to client, like, can you send a mix? Can you remove everything from a mix bus? And that's kind of the worst case for me. But I'm probably just lack of experience like you guys. So
Shall we maybe move on to your Ableton stock process? If you're able to share screen. I think I've just turned it on, or I think you should be able to do a screen share anyway, Nick. Oh, you're muted, mate.
okay, there we go.
Yeah, cool. Everyone see that all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been using kind of a lot of stock Ableton plugins, not because they're like really great or like for any particular reason, but mostly because when I started opening some old sessions in Ableton or Logic, like a bunch of plugins just breaking up, and you have to install them. You have to find what the fuck was this plugin. So I kind of stopped doing this, and this happened to me like a critical point when my computer broke, and I had to like install all the crap which I've been using before, and at some points I realized like I value this limited set of tools which I know really well a lot more than like just jumping around between plugins which last time I worked with like 3 years ago or something, and I can't even remember what the fuck was it doing. So it's really unclear. So I started using only stock plugins just because they're there. I can learn them. They're very simple, and I like as I started to digest what's magic about hardware, and most plugins they emulate hardware, right? So most plugins you see they emulate hardware, and they because like mixing. I think part of the reason is because a lot of mixing engineers are just used to some stuff which they use like in real life or which they like I don't know, some mastering compressors or EQs. And as I started to understand a little bit better why hardware works this way, like how different compressors work, how different type of compression acts, and why, like all the like VCA compression, optical compression, like very mu compression, you start to realize how this voltage is changed inside this machine, how this analog devices work. I started kind of understanding a bit more what can I do to like bring this sort of feeling towards that in my digital. And I think a lot of people have this mythical understanding about analog being this magical thing which makes your stuff magical like by itself. And there's a certain kind of truth to it, but it was never the intent of people who designed it and produced it. It was just something that kind of worked by itself in a way. Because a lot of vintage, I for example hate to deal with vintage stuff. I have a couple of compressors like LA4 and some EQ really old, and I had to deal with old stuff because it just breaks, it's inconsistent, and you have to constantly kind of maintain this. And if you kind of plug it in, plug it on, plug it like turn it off, there's a good chance it's not gonna work next time you kind of turn it on. So I completely abandoned this like chasing vintage stuff, but a lot of people really like that. And as I started to kind of understand a bit better why this vintage stuff and why the analog is so valuable to a lot of people, I started to realize that it was this magical characters those non-linear behavior which exists in analog circuits wasn't really the design of engineers. It mostly flows which are creeped into these circuits, right? And no vintage equipment is similar, or rather identical. Sorry, it's very similar, but it's not identical because engineers who constructed it didn't care much what type of resistor or how do you call it? Oh my God, I'm
Capacitor?
having a stroke. Sorry?
Capacitor?
Yeah, capacitor,
Soothe,
exactly.
Bactrol, that stuff.
Yeah. So what type of resistor or capacitor inductor is used? They just took whatever they had on a shelf and just plug it in. And these old components degraded differently, right? And they changed over time. They swapped to something else. There's like a huge discussion of which type of resistor is best for audio or whatever. So, but the most valuable, I think, what you can sort of learn is why this stuff works. Kind of understand why certain compressor or EQ behaves in a way it does. And to bring an example, like for what I've been using, I've built this rack for myself, which I use like on all channels, and by default it's off. And it essentially is like a input stage with. Actually, let me put it like from the new. It's essentially like an input stage. I use compressor to measure the level of out. Actually, let me open some of the recent set I prepared because I think it explains things a bit more. So can you let me try if you can hear my audio and if it's too loud. Can you hear my audio? Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna make a new channel. So this essentially is the input stage, and I use compressor to see the level, which, let me bring this down. So I use compressor, which is threshold is set at minus 14 dB, and I measure sort of the input level, which comes into this whole processing chain. And the next thing is something I call curves. It's a take on Pultec kind of set of tools, which is like used on Pultec, and I'm very much used to Pultecs. I think the first kind of Pultec I bought just out of curiosity was this Clark Technique, this cheapest dog shit. Well, not dog shit. Sorry, it's a very nice EQ. It works really well, and it sounds.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it is absolutely the most affordable.
Yeah, it costs
Pultec
like
clone
200
output.
euros or something.
It's like I think it's like £150 or just under £200 or something. And they do a range of other classics like the
1176.
1176, yeah, etc.
Yes. Yeah, and like this just slipped. Honestly, it's a wonderful EQ, and the only thing that I'm probably a bit unhappy about it is that it doesn't break up easily. But that's kind of the thing that you can't. I didn't manage to push it into nice saturation, to be frank. But again, that's when I've sort of introduced myself to Pultecs, and I really loved the interaction. It's really simple. If you think of like Pultec, is just a bunch of filters not a bunch. It's actually like 3 filters and 1 resonant peak. So that's it. It's like the whole thing, and the interaction with this is really quick, really simple, and it really allows you to find sweet spots in your mix very quickly, and it works beautifully. I kind of created a take on this, and with this, I will explain in details a little bit more. But essentially, in this strip is also a sort of a compressor which I modeled after, like more or less very mu compressor, which is a tube compressor with you can call it a variable ratio. So the more you push your signal into like behind the threshold, the ratio kind of increases. So it doesn't have like with VCA compression, you have this linear behavior before the threshold, and then it's just straight line kind of compression. Just it compresses evenly depending on a level. With Mu, it's different. It sort of watches the how much compression is going on, and the more compression going on, the more compression is going on. Sorry, I'm. Let me know if it makes sense. So essentially, it's kind of variable bias compression, which works brilliantly in my opinion. It sounds really well, and it can be transparent, but it can saturate really beautifully. So
could you play an example of the different types of compressions you just explained?
Yes, sure, but we had a separate topic on that coming from Duncan, aren't we?
Sorry, say it again. We have.
Yeah, you had a completely separate session on compressors and how you kind of work with compressor in Ableton. So I think we'll touch base on that maybe later, because we'll.
Yeah. I mean, I think. I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, in terms of like understanding, I'd certainly be interested to like hear or at least understand the difference a little bit better. Like, because I hear the terms like FET, VCA, these types of things.
Yeah.
And I'm just a little bit like, I don't know. Is it just going to make everything sound nice?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example because there are like a lot of type of compression, like easiest is a VCA compression, like DBX 160 or SSL bus compressor, which was in their consoles. There are optical compression like LA2A. There are like diode bridge compressor, which is created by Rupert Neve, and it has a very interesting curve, and the way it works is very interesting as well. There are fat compressors like 1176, which is also a very interesting device as well. Am I missing something? Well, digital compression, of course, but the difference between them is the sidechain processing unit, essentially, and how it processes the signal inside the sidechain to kind of determine how much do you need the level of the main signal to be lowered. And the differences between them come from the different circuits they use. Like some are used like tubes, optical elements like an LA2A, which is an optical resistor inside, and the light is flashing on it, and that's how much reduction is happening in the main signal. And they have different behavior because of how circuits are built. So I think it's very valuable if you kind of understand how it works, so you can tune the compressor in Ableton to behave in like a similar manner. But I think we can touch on that in the later. But if we're going back to kind of Pultec, what it is essentially is two shelves, boosting and cutting in the low end. There is a resonant peak, and there is a shelf which cuts in the highs. And in a lot of cases, so first Pultec version, they called it program equalizer because it was essentially dedicated to programs, which was the output for radio, like the main output, master output called program. So that's why they called. There's no particular kind of other reason behind it. They were extremely simple. If you look on the originals, there are like 3 frequencies on the top end. There are like 4 or 5 frequencies, or even less in the low end. There are like 4 or 5 in the resonant peak section. And the reason behind it is because the actual switches are routing the signal through the different set of components. So you are first limited with switches, how many of steps you can switch through, and that limits the number of frequencies you send the signal to. So it's not continuous like you see on a lot of EQs, and they have different topology as well. And what I think makes Pultec really interesting in terms of sound, because it works differently than active compressors, which kind of have units, have like components which require power. So it's a passive compressor, and the reason it's called passive is because the tone stack which changes the sound is based on passive elements. It doesn't require any active elements to kind of change your sound. And when I say passive, it's basically like capacitors, resistors, and inductor. But what passive elements mean is that they can't amplify the signal, but they can only kind of duck the signal. So essentially what happens in Pultec is that the signal is lowered by, I think, 16 dB. Feel free to correct me if I'm missing something. So the incoming signal is lowered by 16 dB. You apply a number of passive filters with changing the curve on your frequency spectrum, and then it's amplified in the output stage with tubes, and it's going through transformer to create a balanced signal as well. And even if you don't apply any changes to the curve, this whole process of amplifying through the tubes and going through a transformer in the original, it actually brings some distortion, some saturation, which a lot of engineers find really valuable and they like it a lot. So sometimes I hear stories that engineers were going through Pultecs with just on bypass, because even if it's on bypass, it still lowers the signal and then goes through amplification stage in the output. So this kind of amplification via tubes brought some saturation and some nice character, because it's not linear, right? And when I say linear, I mean like garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't really, it changes your signal in some kind of way. If you think about analog in general and kind of how the signal is affected, it's not really just a frequency curve in this like instant moment, right? Different if we look at this in a time frame, like for example, like, I don't know, a transient, a 60 seconds, 60 milliseconds, some transient, different frequencies react differently inside this analog domain, inside this analog devices. So it can excite some frequencies, but other frequencies like get ducked or whatever's happening to them. So when I say non-linear, is this exact kind of behavior on the time during, like, I'm not sure if I'm explaining this properly, but we're not talking about like in a single moment if the frequency response is exactly what's going in, going out. We're talking about in dynamics, right? So it just processes this dynamic changes in the sound non-linearly. So again, what Pultec essentially is like really simple stuff. It's just I'm going to just demonstrate really quickly, and then we can digest it a little bit. So essentially, it's like boost and cut in a low end. You can change the frequency, and I added like a low cut because sometimes when you boost top end, it just gets a little bit bottom end, it just gets a little bit out of hand. So just some high pass filtering is helpful. So there's a resonant peak, which on Pultec only goes up, but I've found it really valuable that you can make it down, make it go kind of into cut territory. And there's essentially a high shelf, which on Pultec only goes down. You can only cut with it, so it I think it starts at 5K, I think, on original. I think it's 5K, 10K, and something like 15K or 16K or something. But yeah, it only cuts, but I kind of felt it's valuable if you can boost high frequencies as well. And again, you're in digital world, you're not really limited to a fixed number of frequencies like you do with actual physical switches, right? That's the only reason the number of frequencies is limited, because it's physically kind of difficult at that time, especially to come up with different ways to change more frequencies than your switch actually allows to. And the space inside is also limited, even though it's like a 3U unit. You can't really kind of put more into it than it really allows you to. So there's that. So yeah, any questions so far? Like, I'm happy to address so far.
Can we hear something?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was
Sorry.
just saying, can we hear something going through the Pultec?
Let me try to. Okay, shit.
I was for a little while. I was quite partial to putting kick drums through the Pultec because they were well, not. I don't have one. I was using the Native Instruments
Yeah.
clone of it or something.
Yeah,
It's actually designed by Softube anyway.
I'm afraid I probably can't, unless I can. Shit, it's gonna take us a while. If you want to go on a break, like before I set everything up, because it's set
we
up.
were able to hear your sound before.
Yeah, but it's connected like through my other sound card, which is not connected to my card. So
Did Stephen mean the device in Ableton rather than the
yeah,
actual
I'm at the
Pultec?
Ableton device.
Oh, okay. So okay, sure. I thought you were talking about like the real hardware.
I mean,
thing.
that would
Okay.
be nice, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's take a while. It's probably
Yeah.
possible, but I don't want
Thanks
to
for
risk
clarifying that. That's exactly what I meant, Alex.
it. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, sure. So I've used a couple of tracks here. Okay. Let's see. Can you hear the sound? So that's the track I've just used as an example. So this is the. Is it too loud, guys?
Bit loud.
It sounds fine. I mean, I'm just hearing it through
Sounds fine with me.
the Mac
Sounds
speakers.
fine.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
It's fine. It
Let
was
me
the
know
vocal
when.
harmonies that were kind of like.
Oh yeah, it's some demo. Like I pulled it up like from like Instagram discussion with someone. So
I don't
sorry.
mean bad. I mean just interesting.
Can you tell us when you have it on and off? Because I can't see. It's hard to see.
Sure. So let me know when level is like okay.
That's fine.
Okay. So it's -11. Okay, so here's it's the original playing, so here's I'm switching to the like processed. I'm not sure if you can hear the difference, to be frank.
I don't think I'm hearing the difference. What's changing?
Sure. So there's an EQ, I think some compressions also. Oh, actually,
You got a bypass?
let me even this out, because Sure, sorry. So I think there's a couple of things happening. One of the magical things about Pultec, and it's actually in the original manual, they suggest you not to boost and cut simultaneously. So if you open up original manual, they specifically say don't do that. But what Magic is happening, I actually have, like, before I go into details, so what's actually happening, I pulled this, not sure if you can see it properly.
Mhm.
I pulled the Manly Pultec kind of take because it has really nice detailed curves. So when I explained that, like, it has a shelf which boosts the signal, it has a shelf which cuts the signal, and it has this resonant peak, and it changes a little bit, and it's normal for Pultec because it uses internal, like, it uses inductor, which is in a way like a type of transformer, because it's wire around the magnetic core, but it has taps, and it acts in a way of like capacitor, but it stores magnetic energy rather than electricity. So it's a little bit different and has different sound to it. So this resonant peak, it essentially starts to resonate on certain frequencies and ups them a little bit. It also has
dynamic?
Sorry?
Is it dynamic?
In which way?
I mean, does it move?
Oh, no. It's
No.
it's like it really is a transformer in a way. It's just
Okay.
a wire goes around
Sure.
the magnetic core, and
Okay.
it has taps, so you can like tap from it at different places of the wire and kind of receive different values of farads from it. So, and in Pultec, the number of frequencies is really limited to this inductor, number of taps you get from inductor, because each frequency uses a different values for farads and ohms and so on. So yeah, it has this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 frequencies to work with, which is nice. So the magical trick which a lot of producers use, and I love it, and I've been using it so far, if you look at this curves, which is like cut curves, and this boost curves, they look a little differently. This one is steeper than, the boost curve is steeper than the cut curve. And what happens when you boost and cut simultaneously on the same frequency, you get this sort of hole or rather cuts which starts, and then the kind of boost circuit says no, I take it over from there, and it starts to boost the like further. And on different frequencies and in different settings, you get this sort of a little bit of cuts, and then it goes into boost. And that's the trick what was, I think, like Pultec made famous for, because it just sounds magical on a lot of instruments. Even like the whole saturation thing in the output stage, the whole kind of character that it gives. I think this interaction is what makes Pultec such an easy thing to use, because you can essentially, what I usually start with is I add a little bit, when I hear something is wrong in a low end, I boost like halfway, I cut halfway, and then I switch frequencies until I hear boxiness creep in. So essentially, kind of I cut until all this kind of builds up in 200 hertz to like 600, 700, and I try to kind of, with just three knobs, find this perfect sweet spot for it. And it's really easy to use. It essentially what happens, like, it's not a great demonstration because Ableton curves are a little bit different, but what we have here is two EQ points, which are macroed to this knob, and you change the frequency. So if you boost and cut simultaneously, you get some similar kind of curve. You have a cut and then it goes to boost. I'm gonna remove the filter, this one. So it works a little bit differently, and I've tested a bunch of different Pultec takes, and honestly, each of them have this own thing. For example, the one I have, it has like similar curve when it just lowers, when it goes to like 20 or 30 hertz. Some Pultecs I've tested, well, Pultec clones, go all the way. So your kind of 20 hertz sounds like it's ripping off your speakers. So that's something you have to deal with as well. So that's why I have like a low cut filter sometimes used. Yeah, but what we're essentially doing is what one filter point has, they both have same frequency cutoff points, but they kind of, what difference is the Q point. So one is like original 72, the other one is really low, and 1.1. So what happens, like if you increase it, you don't receive this curve too much. But what happens in Pultec, as I said, like one is steeper, one is less steep, and they kind of overtake each other. So what you can emulate this through this Q, make the one you boost higher Q, the one you cut lower Q, and when you boost and cut simultaneously, you get like this similar curve in it. So it's pretty simple. There's not much to it. With this demo, it's probably...
It is quite a sort of subtle thing.
It's very subtle
to hear, but when you hear it, you kind of almost can't unhear it.
Yeah.
And I really heard it in like the low end, particularly on kick drums. Not so much on kind of like bass or bass guitar or whatever, but certainly on kick drums. And for me, like acoustic kick drums, it's sort of just, I don't know what it's really difficult to explain. It's like it kind of just makes a sort of focal point. It kind of just makes it quite round. It's really difficult to explain what it does, but it sort of just brings it more into focus.
I think the kind of, for me, I think it removes some masking in a way for the low end. It cuts a little bit frequencies just before the important low end frequencies, which you try to emphasize, and it cuts a little bit all the masking before them, so you can hear them much clearer. And the effect is really subtle, and you have to kind of listen to understand what is happening. That's probably, and I also didn't go like into this crazy territory when I kind of, there's just like 1.5 dB here, probably about like 3 dB here and here, so you don't hear it particularly clearly. But once you hear it, you really can't unhear it. It just works. And especially if you're after kind of, as I said, what happens in the output section is that all the amplification through tubes brings this sort of character to the sound as well, and some pleasant harmonics. You can emulate it as well, right? You can use this dynamic tube thing to add some harmonic saturation to your signal after the EQ. You can use this beautiful, how's it called? God damn it. Saturator. Yeah, this thing is just fucking awesome. It's probably my favorite thing, to be frank. Because you can like tune this saturator to behave in a non-linear way, but quite tamed, not in the crazy distortion or like ring modulation territory, but rather like really nicely, subtly saturated. I actually have a demo here as well. So this is the kind of harmonics thing I came up with. It's essentially, it sort of balances the signal between soft clipping chain, which is an analog clip, and it mostly brings this uneven harmonics, and the harmonic saturation, which adds some how do you call it, like odd harmonics, even harmonics, sorry, it brings some even harmonics as well. So, and you can tune it like with this. I use just one thing, which sort of pushes more or less signal through both of them, and you can hear it probably. Let me just try. So here's like really distorted, but you can tone it down a little bit and just add a little bit of shine on top of transients, for example. So yeah, it's not always needs to be on. And again, this is not a mastering tools, to be frank. This is just mixing tools I use. I mostly use this strip for mixing. But as we're talking about Pultec, that's something I use as well. Yeah, so resonance. Oh, again, so going like this is kind of the trick I usually use. I think it's really valuable. It works great on bass. It works great on kick. It works great on on the mix bus. If I have a stereo like Pultec sort of variation, which works really nicely on the whole mix bus, but it kind of has more controls as very similar to what I did here. So as I mentioned, the resonant peaks only goes up on the original, and the shelf only goes down, but you really are not limited to this thing. You can really make it go up with macros, so you can come up with various kind of curves where you want to take away some 2 dB, 2K, 2 kilohertz, and you want to boost top end more, and you can add other stuff if you need to as well, if you need additional correction somewhere. So, but again, there's no, at least I don't feel like there is some particular magic to this EQ. I don't feel people will feel a lot of difference between real Pultec and some things you just can do with EQ, with some saturation plugins and so on. I still feel it sounds really nice, and it's just if you think about this, EQ and compression is just tools, for you to address some problems and make the sound better. Or better is also relative, right? For me it's better, for you it's worse. So there's really no one thing. That's what I said, that mastering engineers mostly kind of taste and trust. One master engineer, you like what it does, it makes wide mixes, the other do not, and makes this really focused kind of boomy mixes or whatever. So again, there's no kind of good thing. Pultec is just an excellent tool, which is really simple, and it allows you to find a lot of sweet spots in your track really, really quickly. But you don't really have to make a macro for it as well. You can just pull up the EQ and just do it manually with your hands, right? You don't have to kind of do all this stuff particularly kind of. That's the same thing what you would get on a Pultec, right? So you don't have to go through all this stuff. It's just something I've used to, and I did this, but you really don't have to. To be in all seriousness, right now I'm transitioning to Logic. I'm going away from Ableton to Logic because I want to know more about this, more spatial mixing, this Dolby Atmos mixing, and it has tools built in for it. So I'm really curious how it works. I still don't have an Atmos setup, but I'm kind of trying to explore this at least a little bit. But yeah, I feel there's a lot of value in stock plugins. You just have to understand how what are you trying to do and why hardware works for you.
I think the Nick, adding those macros there is, for me, is what really unlocks this, because to me this looks like, in simple terms, the same way you fiddle around with on an analog subtractive synth. You're just looking for the little sweet spots, and what you've introduced here is not just clicking random points on a line manually. You've actually brought some methodology into this. So like you say, you're looking for sweet spots. So I think you've elevated the plugin.
Well, again, if you understand how it works and if you learn to hear the problems with the mix, you really don't need these tools. It's just someone create, and you have to also understand that a lot of hardware tools which a lot of people like came not from not from opportunities, but rather from limitations. They can't really, like I said, they can't really make infinitely changeable like a resonant peak frequency, but you really like can do this with Ableton, right? It doesn't really limit it to this. But so a lot of hardware you use have limitations, and I, for example, use both EQ to make some sharp cuts and have some kind of really surgical things that I need to address in the mix, and I use Pultec for more wide changes, like character changes in the track.
I think you're I think you mentioned earlier on that you're a UI designer.
Yeah.
And I can see very clearly here that you've applied all the complexity you've described, and just as a comment, like explained really well. I think I'm actually beginning to understand what you're talking about here. So thank you for going through that detail. But the point I'm making is probably because you're a UI designer, you've taken the complexity out of that. If I start playing around with this manually, I'm lost in what does it actually do. Whereas what you're allowing us to do here is focus on the sweet spots, which is what we're really interested in. So this is bringing your skills in understanding of mastering, but also I think the UI aspect of this is not to be underestimated.
Definitely.
That's a quite British way of saying, can you share your plugin strip?
I'm happy.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Yeah,
I'm happy to do so. Like whatever you guys feel valuable, I'm happy to do so. Feel free to play around with it. I have a lot of stuff which I made, which I found exciting. Like for example, I've made this plugin which called Wide Harmonics, and what it does essentially, it has this complicated chain which what you do is you produce from the signal that goes through it, you produce a separate set of even odd harmonics, and you can essentially pan them left and right. So when I hear some bass, I don't really have this at hand which I can demo, unfortunately, but what it does is essentially sends like even harmonics to the left, like odd harmonics to the right, and you get this sort of wider instrument, wider result without creating any phase issues. Because how like in a lot of plugins, well, not nowadays, but old plugins, they just switch phase sometimes, sending left to the right. So when you mono it, it just cancels each other, like it cancels itself out. So I kind of figured out if I need to make some bass, for example, wider in the high, like in the high end, I add some. Well, actually, let me demo. Maybe it can work on this thing. Just a sec.
I feel like this could be a really nice segue into talking about mid-side processing.
Are we doing that?
You kind of opened the door with talking about widening based on spectrum.
Like, I don't know what's going on with mid-side at all.
Yeah.
When you mentioned just then about, I was totally clicking what you were saying about like you're creating this sort of stereo width without any phase.
Yeah, so let me demo it. Not sure.
I've never ever thought about listening to my mixes in mono, and until I just heard someone say, "Oh, yeah, you got to do it," and I was like, "Really? Oh shit, I've been doing it wrong like all this time." And like exactly for that reason, because like you don't want to like suddenly listen to your mix in mono and then the entire song's gone, because I'm always like putting stuff like really far in the panorama, like, so yeah, we can definitely touch on that for sure.
I'm like, in my personal experience, that's one of the most common problems I have with mixes which are sent to me, because they use this weird kind of widening techniques, which when you start to kind of try to fix, there is no mid, it's just blurred to the sides, and it's just this, there's no focus on specific instruments because the mid is lost with the sides being too loud, and especially if you think what side is, sometimes when you mono it, it's just kind of boom, gone. So yeah, we can touch base on that. So let me just demo if this can even be. So it's pretty widespread. So it's pretty mono right now. So I'm gonna switch it on. It's extremely exaggerated at the moment because it's on a whole mix. But you can hear that different type of harmonics is on one side and on the other. Let me try on this track actually. Maybe it's gonna.
I could hear that
probably
quite
something
clearly
for-
in there.
This is something
Yeah,
for the
that's cool.
headphone crew, I think. Headphone crew, get your headphones on. I ain't got mine on at the moment.
That was really cool.
Some techno track, sorry. So it's right now it's really exaggerated because I kind of boosted it really heavily. But if you have like this tiny bits of it on a couple of tracks in your mix, it really widens on bass, for example, on some synths, and it really widens the tone, like moves the saturation points from mid to low end. So right now it's in the mid, it's more on the low end. And you kind of have to find this whole saturation kind of thing. You can. So it's really exaggerated and sounds like shit. But if you put it on separate instruments, it sounds. It creates this widens the whole mix just a tiny bit. You put it on separate instrument, it works great. But yeah, that's. But again, all I'm trying to highlight is not this specific kind of thing that I came up with, but how powerful really Ableton plugins and the whole chaining system is in Ableton. It allows you, if you kind of think about it like creatively, you can do a lot of things. Like for example, and you have to know how it works as well. Like for example, to isolate harmonics, you have to create like harmonics and then mix it with a signal with a switched phase. So you would cancel out the original signal, and you can only hear the distortion in the signal. So it's a sort of a null, like a null test, but failed null test. Yeah. So and you can like spread it out. So you can do a lot of stuff creatively, which works quite nicely. So Ableton is extremely powerful and has incredible set of tools to create all this stuff. So it's amazing in my opinion.
Well, here.
They sounded sick, those ones, just then.
Incidentally, if anyone out there wants to buy a Pultec EQ, they're available on Sweetwater for $4,295. Or just do the boost and cut in the stock. That's kind of like, I think that's quite a nice way to wrap up the Pultec ethos.
I have a thing to say about this. Earlier, Nick mentioned the fact that the Pultec is a passive circuit design, which, as far as I understand, or as best as I can understand, are constantly living and dying based off of the amplitude of the incoming signal, which is attributes what can be attributed to his talking about the nonlinear response of elements over time. Things are just much more lively coming out of it because of the circuit design. I don't think that can be recreated with the computer. I think that the EQ curves are not the thing that I would say are magic about the hardware design.
There's a bunch of shit like that. My Alltech Lansing high pass filter, which I searched the whole wide world for. It's a passive high pass filter, but nothing sounds like it. I mean, it made the reggae sound for like 10 years. You know, it was King Tubby.
Is that the King Tubby filter?
Yeah. The big nut. Yeah.
Of course.
Totally passive. Huh?
Sorry, go ahead.
I was done. What?
Oh, okay. Yeah, but yeah, of course, hardware brings certain character to this, but if you really don't have money to spend on hardware, and especially like expensive hardware, the the kind of the cost of this additional magic, which comes with hardware, is in my opinion, is a bit overvalued. I think you can do like 90% with stock stuff, and all this kind of magical mojo, sometimes called, goddamn, so many stupid words.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think
it's just not worth it in my opinion.
No, it's a mugs game. If you actually think you could hear the difference between, an analog recorded MP3 and a digitally recorded, you know what I mean, from like Ampex tape all the way to MP3, or from, laptop to MP3, you're a fool, or you just have absolutely like godlike ears. There's no, years ago, like I mentioned at first about, the digital distortion and the fact that you could make tape clip, but you couldn't do it on a computer. This was different, but that's going away more and more by the minute.
Oh yeah.
There's very little need for like most hardware. Certain compressors, yeah, but at the same time, I mean, the minute difference that you're getting as opposed to the 7,500 quid you're going to spend is totally like ridiculously worth it.
It's the law of diminishing returns.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Just some cost is more like it. I totally agree with you on that one, Monstraux.
Yeah, I had a weird experience when a friend of mine, like long time ago,
we don't talk about stuff like this here. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. What did you want to say?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. Yeah, because I had a friend who brought some track in, and we decided to redo some stuff. And I mentioned I have like a 16-track 2-inch tape machine, which we used to re-record the track. And I remember distinctly this moment when I bounced from the tape to the DAW, and he said, "Oh, it sounds like very clean and perfect," and I expected some kind of like degradation and stuff. But really there shouldn't be. Like, engineers back then never would even consider recording something with distortion. It was never a thing. They wanted to do it really clearly with like how it was recorded. It was extremely important. And he was so kind of excited to record it on tape. And in the end, it sounded just like we've recorded to DAW. So a lot of myths are really kind of, a lot of opinions out there which don't really hold.
And haven't for 20 years. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. There's something to be said about as far as workflow goes, I still don't think I know what that word means, but I like to, if I have an idea for a song, I'll program the melody into like one of my large modular synths and, sample it for 20 minutes, then chop it up and throw it into a DAW. And, that's pretty much the way I make music these days. And especially with Eurorack, there's a lot of, like, Eurorack's too small for analog gear. Like, it's not the right format. It really shines in digital. It's most of its effects suck, or they make plugins that are way better. But I'm going to record it directly onto my computer. I'm not going to use. Did you say 16-inch? So you said 2-inch 16-track tape? 2 inches.
Yes, it's 16 channel.
Track.
Sorry?
2 inches usually 24, but
I have 16-inch tape recorder. It's a God damn it! I'm having a stroke.
That's okay.
What's it called? God damn it!
Please
Let
don't
me
have
check.
a stroke on
Let
me.
me check.
Kai, Ampex.
Sounds like a cue to take 5, guys.
Yeah, if anyone wants to take 5, do it.
I actually.
How much longer do you think it will go on?
It's Saturday, yeah. It's Saturday.
Oh yeah, I mean we've been going for what 3 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's nothing.
We can, if you want to wrap it
It
up
is
and
true.
Get out of here, that's all good. I mean,
Well,
I'm
I gotta
I'm
go
happy to
give
keep
a
going,
chess
Bill.
lesson. Like
No, I'm gonna hang
Oh
around.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I'm gonna have a
what I
smoke.
really do for a living. So I will be back, and I won't. Hopefully, you guys will still be here. You usually are. Nice one, bruv, and good to meet you, Monstraugs. Been very educational. I hope you guys are still here in about an hour.
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah.
Bye.
Cheers, Josh.
See you, mate.
I'm trying to leave, man. I hate these long goodbyes. I just want.
Yeah, I suppose like.
Is there anything else from that list we really wanted to cover? Is there anything on there that would really make
Seems
the
like
whole
we
thing?
covered most of it.
I've been looking at Pultec EQs. I mean, I suppose if I could sort of bring it all into a wrap and kind of reflect a lot on what we've talked about, and also use it as a potential segue for a future episode, because I'm going to do more of these. But like, I think like it's really all about kind of going through what I call the cringe test. And if you can go through something and not go like, then if you're not sucking air in through your teeth when you're listening to something, then it's kind of fine. And maybe it's time to go to the next stage, which for me is like, well, I'm going to give it to someone else to master and make it sound nicer in a way that, so I don't have to worry about it, you know? So, and I, you know, this the thing about that we've been talking about like tastes and like trusting your own decisions and all that sort of stuff. That kind of fits in that category for me, I think, of like just being able to like trust your own judgment, which is, yeah, as I say, could be like something that we could touch on in a future episode. But yeah, I mean, like if everyone wants to wrap up now, I think that was a brilliant first episode.
A lot of good stuff.
I agree.
Yeah.
Really good content there. Really
I have
good
one
content.
thing coming. Just give me a second.
Okay.
Hey Ned, or it might be cool is if like at the end of your episode you could kind of sum up like what happened and how you could apply it to your productions or Ableton or some kind of way to simplify.
I mean, I think the one thing that's definitely resonating with me is that, like, if you're an Ableton user, and I think indeed if you're any DAW user, everything you need is going to be there by today's standards. And I think that's kind of like what where Nick is coming from, is that, you know, like, I wouldn't have had the first idea about how to reverse engineer a Pultec EQ curve in order to try and recreate it using a macro setup in Ableton. But the fact that it's there, the fact that it's possible, is encouraging me enough to explore it. You know, before I would just kind of think, I want that classic Pultec EQ sound. I'm just going to buy a plugin or whatever. But I think it's definitely. That said, I think it's definitely like healthy to sort of just share with people that really everything you need is there in your stock plugins, and it's
your
sometimes
ears.
just a case of having a little bit of guidance. Sorry, Aaron.
Your ears and monitoring setup, the familiarity that you have with your monitoring setup, and the amount that you can trust your ears. I just put something in the chat that is I guess was a facet of the curriculum that I was present for in college. We had this thing that we would return to maybe like for 30 minutes of every class throughout the semester. And it was called the Dave Moulton Golden Ears course, which is basically just presenting cuts across a range. It's just like building confidence in your ability, or building confidence in how much you can trust your ears. So like, for one example, there would be like music, you'd have to uh, you would have to be able to identify which band or which octave of the spectrum, let's say 20, 40, 80, 160, 320, 640, etc. You'd have to identify which one is getting either cut or boosted on either musical content or noise or pink noise or whatever. Anyway, I just put a link to that in the chat, and I think that that's a great place to start for people that want to educate themselves, like to be able to just build their own competence in their hearing.
Is that the Molten Laboratories?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I've just pinged up all these links that have been in the chat. I'm gonna keep them open and put them in the video description. That sounds like ear training to me. Yeah.
It is.
More kind of scientific ear training rather than it kind of being like a musical ear training, like how to, what interval is this?
Exactly. Exactly.
Or like what frequency is this?
It's like, so after I took this course or whatever, my family are I guess I found myself in church. And one of the mics were feeding back, and I walked back to the booth and I just told them to cut 600, and it just dissipated immediately. And everyone was like, "Whoa, what's happening?" I'm just like, it was 600 that was feeding back.
You got magic ears.
Well,
How long did it take you to
Right.
develop? How long did it take you to develop? Or where did you start before you started using this to practice? I mean, were you already advanced, or did you not know anything when you started, or how long did it, or where were you?
Well, I've always been into music. My parents are band directors, and I was, I guess, focused on performance for quite some time, and then went to do composition, and then it was like, I've already been doing composition I want to like focus on the procedural aspect of production, and yeah, I guess my ears were attuned to, like, I was always an attentive listener, but that was completely foreign to me. The idea of like identifying spectral, whatever. Anyway, it's just like, how much can you trust your ears? And that I think is directly correlated with how bold you are willing to go with your own decision making.
At this point, can you pretty much hear without seeing a graph where things are on the spectrum?
I would say so.
That's really cool because I know the area where it might be, but I usually don't have a very specific idea where I'm right. That's really cool. I think it would be pretty cool to have this for sure. If I may, I also wanted to plug something if you're interested in mixing and mastering. Unfortunately, we're not paid by them, but maybe in the future. But yeah, Mix with the Masters, it has a lot. I can actually share my screen probably, right? Can I still share my screen? Yeah, so Mix with the Masters is a sort of service. It's not cheap. I think it costs something like 200 to 50 a year. But it has a lot of videos where mastering and mixing engineers explain their workflow, and producers as well. And it's extremely valuable for me was to see like what stuff they are doing, not to solve specific problems because they not always explain what's happening, but rather you can see how they track a problem. When you see like an engineer like Chris Lord-Alge who just boosts the EQ curve to the max and then just sweeping it to find where the problem is, and then toning it down, it really feels like a valid way to work, and it's really nice. Because there are a lot of discussions on forums, like, do you solo tracks and EQ them? Do you kind of not solo them and EQ them while they're playing the whole mix? And all these engineers do it differently. Like, they do it both ways, sometimes one way, sometimes another. And it really helps you to build your confidence because you really, and like, don't trust everything you read on forums. Just watch how professionals do it, because in forums, like everyone has an opinion because it just works for them. So yeah, watching these guys work really helped me to kind of understand that everything goes. Like whatever you have, whatever helps you, do your stuff. Just anything goes.
That like boosting and sweeping to find the ugly frequency was like one of the first sort of tricks that I heard from multiple sources where I was like, that's a thing that I'm gonna need to know.
Yeah, and
it's normally the first thing I do on an acoustic snare is to just like, I've got to find where that ring is and like pull that out. I mean, when I've either like just done when I've either recorded my own drum kit or maybe done a few mixes for like other people where there's drums, I'm just like, well, that's normally like the first kind of mix engineer trick that I go for. And it's like it really works because you those things just scream out at you, like they're instantly noticeable.
It's definitely a gain staging related issue, is identifying your resonance buildup, and I would like to reiterate OEK Sounds Soothe 2 is like programmed to do that automatically. And is incredibly helpful.
Do you have any resources for where to learn more about resonance buildup? Or
what do you mean?
Like, do you have any tutorials, like YouTube tutorials, or any resources to learn more about resonance buildup or what it is? So like you can,
look
like
at
if you can
Soothe
call it by
2.
name.
Just look at Soothe 2. It's all about it. Like you. Yeah.
Well, I have that, but I mean, I don't
okay.
like. I'm not familiar with the term resonance buildup. So
okay. It's just like go ahead.
I was just gonna say if like you already know what the problem is, so you know what to do. But if like for somebody who doesn't understand what the problem is, so they know when they go to use Soothe to what you're actually trying to tackle.
Yeah. I guess let's say finding the character of the element that you like, and then the seeing how much the energy of the waveform or the energy of the spectrum response is reinforcing the qualities that you appreciate about the element that you're treating. It's just dissipating the qualities that you do not like of your signal versus the qualities that you do. It's kind of like, it's just equalization. And just being able to ascertain which is not helping you and being able to ascertain which is the trick.
I guess that's the
What he was talking
I guess
about,
I would wanna
sweeping. He was sweeping across, hearing the gnarly frequencies or whatever. The stuff that's jumping out at you is the resonance buildup. That's all.
Is it any deeper than just like using your ear? You hear something you don't like, turn it down, and you hear something you like, turn it up. Is there more to it than that? Like you said, you're just sweeping for the stuff that you don't like, or is there anything more scientific about it?
Like I said earlier with the course that I dropped in the chat, where it's identifying problematic. Yeah, that's something that like used to take me a really long time before I took that course or whatever. But now it's like I feel pretty assertive with my I'm just, the identification of the problematic stuff is easier now, I think.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Like if I go look at that thing the link you sent, that would probably sharpen my ear for locating the issue quicker or more specifically, I guess. I don't know.
It's going to be a meditative, it's going to not be the most recreational activity you ever undertake. It's going to be a very...
it's not going to be like Wordle.
It's not going to be fun. It's not going to be fun.
I think it's definitely something I've noticed when I've been to live gigs, particularly with like badly engineered, like live engineered electric guitars, where there's just something awful happening in the high mids. And I'm kind of like, I might actually have to leave because this is just hurting, you know.
Like a baby screaming or something.
But I wouldn't have the first idea, like to be able to just go, you need to cut it at 600 hertz right now. Like I wouldn't have the first idea, but I can like I can hear it, but I don't know where it is. Does that make sense? Zoom is yet again raising my hand on my behalf. I think if I do a thumb, it will do a thumb as well. There we go. Just done my thumb.
That's so funny.
Why don't we wrap it up there, guys? What do you think?
Sounds good.
Thanks so much, guys. This is awesome.
All right,
Fantastic,
that was
guys.
thank you so much for your time, your knowledge.
Thanks, everyone.
Don't everyone go just yet. I'll just stop the recording. But so I guess I need to go back into broadcaster mode now. I hope you've enjoyed that. Stay tuned for the next one.
Bye. Bye and stop recording.